My mother pushed a 12-page spreadsheet across the dinner table and told me I owed her $30,000. Not asked, told. She set it down next to the green beans like it was just another dish for the table, and she watched my face the way you watch a pot to see if it's finally going to boil. Your first payment is $2,000, she said. Due Sunday, or we take the car. I hadn't even taken my jacket off. I'd been in that house 11 minutes. My father, Michael, didn't look up from his plate when he added the part that was supposed to finish me off. And starting today, we're charging 10% interest, compounding monthly. Just like a real landlord would. He said it like he'd rehearsed it in the car. Like a real landlord would, as if the two of them had spent the afternoon deciding which phrase would land hardest. My sister Jessica laughed into her wine glass, a short, surprised bark of a laugh, the kind you can't fully suppress when something delights you more than you expected. My Aunt Diane, who'd shown up for a Tuesday dinner in a blazer, like she'd been called in as a witness, looked at me across the table and said, "Well, I guess the bum finally has to pay for something." Four faces I had known my entire life, watching me the way you watch a play you already know the ending to. Nobody looked surprised. Nobody looked uncomfortable. They looked like they'd been waiting for this dinner for a long time, and now that it had finally arrived, they intended to enjoy it. I looked down at the spreadsheet. 12 pages, printed and stapled, with a cover sheet that read Family Ledger, A. Sullivan in a font I recognized instantly, because I'd grown up watching my mother print things in that exact font off the family computer in the office nobody else was allowed into. Line items. Dates going back 4 years. Rent, utilities, storage, something called family administration. A processing fee of $160, tacked on at the very end, for no reason I could find anywhere else on the page, except that it was the exact amount needed to round the total from $29,840 to an even, dramatic $30,000. I want you to understand something before I go any further, because it matters for everything that comes after. I am not a person who panics at a dinner table. I have sat across from clients who screamed at me over a missed deadline. I have delivered bad news to a CEO in a boardroom without my voice shaking. I've spent 6 years building a career out of exactly this skill, staying level when everyone around me wants a reaction badly enough to manufacture one. Whatever my family expected to see on my face in that moment, fear, humiliation, the particular collapse of a person finally caught, they didn't get it. They got quiet. They got a woman studying a spreadsheet like it was a client brief. I think that's what unsettled them most, if I'm honest, looking back. Not the silence itself, but what the silence meant. A daughter who cried, or begged, or slammed her hand on the table, that daughter, they knew exactly how to manage. They'd been managing her, in one form or another, for 28 years. A daughter who simply took out her phone and started documenting the crime scene they'd built for her, that daughter was something none of them had ever had to plan for. And somewhere around page 4, studying the strangely precise numbers, 847. 33 for garage utilization, a figure with cents attached, as if someone had run an actual calculation instead of guessing, I understood something that mattered more than the insult of it. Someone had built this, carefully, on purpose, long before I walked through that door. I photographed every page with my phone, one at a time, in full view of all 4 of them, because I wanted them to watch me do it and understand exactly what kind of daughter they'd raised. Then I set my fork down, which I hadn't used yet, and I stood up. "Sit down," my mother said. "We're not finished." "I am," I said, and I meant it in a way that would take all 4 of them a week to fully understand. I didn't argue about my career. I didn't remind them that the car in question, a silver Honda parked in their driveway with my name, and only my name, on the title, had been paid for with my own money from my own accounts for 3 straight years. I didn't ask the question that was screaming loudest in my head, which was how, exactly, my mother had invented 4 years of rent for a daughter who had spent most of that time living 600 miles away in San Francisco. I packed one bag. I took my keys off the hook by the door before anyone could think to stop me. And I walked out of my parents' house a little before midnight, into a warm Santa Ana night that smelled like somebody's neighbor was still running a sprinkler, and I did not look back at the house or the 4 faces still sitting at that table. 7 days later, my phone lit up at 1 in the morning. My sister, "Dude, Mom found something in the mail and she's screaming. Please answer." 23 minutes after that, my aunt, "Your mom and dad are here sobbing. Please call them back." They still thought I was the one in trouble. They had absolutely no idea what that envelope in the mail was about to reveal, or that the exact amount they'd invoiced me, $29,840, wasn't a coincidence at all. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope, and what happened in the 7 days between that dinner and that 1 a.m. text, let me back up and tell you who I am, because I think you deserve to know exactly who was sitting at that table when my mother decided I was worth exactly $30,000. My name is Amber Sullivan. I'm 28 years old, and until 11 days before that dinner, I thought the worst thing that had ever happened to me in that house was being told, at 16, that advertising wasn't a real career for someone as smart as I was supposed to be. I'd spent 6 years by then building an actual career out of that unserious field anyway, first as a junior strategist at a boutique agency in Sacramento. Then, after 2 promotions and a lot of unpaid overtime I never once complained about at family dinners, as a senior brand strategist in San Francisco, managing accounts most people in my extended family had never heard of and wouldn't have been impressed by even if they had. I wasn't rich. I wasn't famous, but I was good at what I did, careful with my money, and entirely capable of standing on my own, which turned out to matter enormously for everything that came next, even though nobody at that dinner table seemed to remember it. If this is your kind of story, the kind where someone finally stops explaining themselves to people who never intended to listen, I'd love for you to subscribe to Revenge Lab. We tell true, honest stories about the moment ordinary people stopped being quiet, and I think you're going to want to be here for what my family did next, and what I did back. I'd been back in Santa Ana for exactly 1 week before that dinner. The agency I'd worked at in San Francisco had merged with a larger firm 3 months earlier, and I'd taken a severance package instead of a forced transition. A good one, generous, the kind of package you take because you're not desperate, not because you're drowning. I had savings. I had references. I had 2 solid interviews lined up for a regional strategy role that would put me an hour and a half from Santa Ana instead of 6, which had felt, at the time, like a genuinely good thing. A chance to be closer to home again. I hadn't told my mother any of that. I'd told her I needed a place to stay for a week while I figured out my next move, because I wanted exactly 1 week of my life where I wasn't performing my own success for an audience. 1 week where nobody was grading me. Linda doesn't do silence well. She fills it. And in the absence of an actual explanation from me, she'd apparently spent that week deciding, and then telling other people, that I'd been fired. That I'd come home broke and humiliated, tail between my legs, finally forced to admit that the career she'd never approved of had collapsed exactly the way she always said it would. I didn't find that out until later, but I want you to sit with it for a second because it's the hinge everything else turns on. My mother had translated my privacy, 1 week, that's all I'd asked for, into failure. And she had used that imagined failure as permission to put me on trial in front of the whole family, with a spreadsheet as the indictment. I called my best friend Emma from the driver's seat of my own car, parked 2 blocks from my parents' house, because my hands were shaking too hard to drive yet, and I needed to hear a voice that wasn't performing anything at me. "Come here," Emma said before I'd even finished the first sentence. "Right now, I'll make coffee." Emma Reyes and I had been friends since 10th grade algebra, back when she was the girl who actually understood logarithms, and I was the girl copying her homework in the hallway before first period, trading her gossip for math answers in a deal that felt, at 14, like the smartest arrangement either of us had ever made. She was a litigation paralegal now, had been for 6 years, at a mid-sized firm in Orange County that handled mostly business disputes, contracts, partnerships, the occasional messy divorce with property at stake. I didn't fully understand, that night on her couch, how much that particular skill set was about to matter. I just knew she was the one person I trusted not to tell me to calm down. She didn't. She made coffee, handed me a blanket like I was someone who'd survived a car accident, and asked to see the invoice. I handed her my phone, the photos already open. She scrolled through all 12 pages without saying a word, her face doing the thing it used to do in high school right before she caught someone in a lie on a test, a small, focused stillness, like she was listening for something underneath the numbers. "This isn't rounded," she said finally. "What?" $29,840. That's not a number somebody makes up in a fit of anger. Angry people round up to 30,000 and call it a day. This is a number somebody calculated. She flipped back to the first page. And look, a $160 processing fee added at the very end, right after the subtotal. That's the fee that turns $29,840 into an even 30. Somebody wanted the dramatic round number for the dinner table, but the actual number, the real number they needed, was $29,840. I stared at her. Needed for what? "I don't know yet," Emma said, "but Amber, they don't believe this invoice. Nobody believes their own daughter owes them 4 years of back rent for a house she wasn't living in. They need this. There's a difference." That sentence sat in my chest for the rest of the night and honestly for the rest of the week. They don't believe it. They need it. I told her everything I could remember about that dinner. The way my mother had watched my face for the crack in it. The way Michael had added the interest line like a punchline he'd been saving. The way Jessica's laugh had come too fast to be spontaneous. The way Diane, who I barely saw outside of holidays, had shown up dressed for the occasion like she'd been invited specifically to witness my humiliation. "Your dad," Emma said slowly, scrolling to a line item near the bottom. This one, garage utilization, 4 years, $847.33. "Amber, you told me your car's been parked in a paid lot near your old apartment this whole time." "It has. I have 3 years of parking receipts in my email." "Then that's not a mistake. That's fraud with a decimal point on it. Nobody accidentally invents cents." She looked up at me. "This is too organized to be a tantrum. Somebody built this like a real financial document and then handed it to you like it was one." At 8 the next morning, my phone rang. "Linda." I let it go. It rang again 4 minutes later. Then again. By 8:12 she'd called 6 times, and I sat on Emma's couch watching the screen light up over and over, feeling something in me that used to be dread starting, slowly, to turn into something colder and steadier. The 7th call came from Michael. I answered that one, mostly because some small, stupid part of me still hoped he'd called to apologize for the interest comment. He didn't. "Your mother wants the car key left on the kitchen counter by Sunday," he said, without a hello, without asking where I was or whether I was all right. "If you can't make the payment." "Say that again." "The key, on the counter. By Sunday." His voice had that careful, flattened quality he used whenever Linda was in the room, listening. "She's already talked to someone who can move the car quickly, if it comes to that." Michael. I hadn't called him Dad in that sentence, and I noticed myself not doing it, and I let it stay that way. The registration, the insurance, the loan payoff, and the title are all in my name, all 4 of them. There is no version of this where you or Mom moves that car. There was a pause, and then he said the sentence that ended whatever excuse I'd still been making for him, quietly, for 28 years. "We helped you when you were younger," he said. "Don't make this ugly." That was Michael's whole method. I understood, sitting on Emma's couch with the phone against my ear. Not cruelty. Silence, and then, when the silence was no longer enough, a soft, reasonable-sounding sentence that made someone else's demand sound like his own gentle suggestion. "Linda built the trap. Michael handed you the bait and told you it was for your own good." Jessica texted 20 minutes later, "Just pay something so Mom gets off everyone's back." I typed out 3 different responses and deleted all of them before I finally wrote back, "Why does everyone's peace depend on my money?" She sent back a single laughing emoji, followed by, "Because you're the one who came crawling home." I looked at that message for a long time. I wanted to write 4 paragraphs back, every unfair thing Jessica had ever said to me since we were kids, every time she'd gotten to be the golden daughter simply by staying close and agreeing with everything Linda said. I didn't. I took a screenshot instead and saved it in a new folder on my phone, and something in that small, unglamorous action, save, don't send, felt like the first genuinely useful decision I'd made in 18 hours. By noon, Emma and I had built a folder on her laptop labeled, simply 30,000. Into it went the photographed invoice pages, the screenshots of every text, my car's title and registration, 3 years of parking receipts, and every bank statement I could find showing exactly where I had lived and what I had paid during the years my family claimed I'd been occupying their house rent-free. "There's one more thing I want to check," Emma said, staring at the invoice's footer, a small line of text in gray, easy to miss if you weren't the kind of person who reads footers. "This. SBH Administration." "What's SBH?" I felt something shift in my stomach before my brain had even caught up to why. "Sullivan Property Holdings," I said slowly. "It's my family's company. My grandmother started it. Linda's run it since Grandma got sick." Emma looked at me. "Your mother put a family business's accounting footer on a personal invoice she handed you at dinner." I hadn't clocked it at the table. I'd been too busy watching four faces watch me. But sitting on Emma's couch at noon the next day, staring at those 3 small letters, I understood that Linda hadn't handwritten that spreadsheet in a fit of resentment the night before I arrived. She'd used the company's actual accounting template, the one she'd have needed a password or an office key to access, to build a fake bill for her own daughter. That detail bothered me more than every insult at that table combined. I called her. She picked up on the first ring, which told me she'd been waiting for it. "Why is Sullivan Property Holdings listed on a personal rent invoice?" I asked, no greeting, nothing softening it. For 3 full seconds, she said nothing. I could hear, faintly, papers sliding on a table, and then Diane's voice, low, just at the edge of the receiver. "Don't explain anything." "Don't play accountant with me, Amber," Linda finally said. "Sunday's deadline hasn't changed." And then she hung up. I sat with the phone still against my ear for a second after the call ended, listening to nothing, and I felt the last of my confusion start to reorganize itself into something with an actual shape. My mother wasn't just angry at me for coming home unannounced, for not immediately explaining every detail of my life, for whatever imagined failure she decided to believe about my career. She was scared of something, scared enough to try to extract $30,000 from her own daughter inside of a week, using her dying mother's company as the paper trail. "I want the blue box," I told Emma. "The what?" "My grandmother gave me a document box before she died. Blue, metal, the kind with a little brass latch. My mother always called it sentimental clutter and kept it in my old closet. I never thought about it much. I'm starting to think that was on purpose." Emma grabbed her keys. "Then let's go get it before your mother thinks about it too." We didn't go back to the house right away. Emma made me eat something first. A grilled cheese sandwich I barely tasted, cut into triangles the way her mother used to make it for both of us in high school, back when Emma's kitchen had been the one place I could disappear to for a few hours without anyone asking me to explain myself. "Can I tell you something?" she said, once I'd finished half the sandwich, "that I've never really told you before." I nodded, still half somewhere else, still turning the invoice over in my mind. "My dad did something similar," she said, "smaller scale, when I was in college. He'd co-signed a loan for my brother's business, and when it went bad, he told my mom it was actually my loan, on paper, because my credit was better at the time and he'd used my information without really asking. I found out when a collections agency called me during finals week my junior year. She said it plainly, without much visible emotion, the way you describe something you've spent a long time making peace with. I never told you that. I don't know why. I think some part of me was embarrassed that I let it happen, that I didn't fight it the way you're fighting this." "What did you do?" "I paid part of it," she said, "not because I owed it, because it felt easier than the fight would have been, at 20, with finals bearing down on me and no idea how to even start standing up to my own father." She looked at me steadily. "That's part of why I made coffee that first night instead of telling you to calm down, Amber. I know exactly how fast family can turn into a word people use to make you stop asking questions. I wasn't going to let you do what I did." I sat with that for a long moment, understanding, for the first time, that Emma's steadiness through all of this hadn't come from nowhere. It had come from a version of this exact fight she'd once lost, quietly, without a paralegal job yet, without the tools she'd later go on to build for herself specifically, so she'd never lose that kind of fight again. "Thank you," I said, "for not making coffee and telling me to calm down." "Thank you for actually fighting it," she said. "I think some part of me has been waiting 10 years to watch someone do what I didn't." Before I tell you what happened when we got there, I need to tell you about my grandmother, because I don't think any of this makes sense without her. Evelyn Sullivan built Sullivan Property Holdings out of one small duplex she bought with her own savings in her 30s. Back when a woman buying property alone still required a male relative to co-sign the loan in most places, and she'd apparently gone through 3 banks before she found one willing to lend to her without my grandfather's signature attached. She used to tell that story at holidays, every few years, with the specific relish of someone who still enjoyed having proven a point decades after the point needed proving. By the time I was old enough to understand what the business even meant, it had grown into the house my parents lived in, the duplex, and eventually 2 additional rental units Evelyn acquired one at a time over 20 years, always in cash, always after months of careful saving, never once financed by anyone else's money or anyone else's permission. I remember the office in that house, a small room off the kitchen with a roll-top desk and a filing cabinet that locked, the only locked door in the entire house, which as a kid struck me as almost funny, like the family kept its secrets in the one room nobody was allowed to make a mess in. I remember watching my grandmother sit at that desk on Sunday afternoons, going through envelopes, making phone calls to tenants about repairs, writing things down in a ledger with a fountain pen she refused to replace even after the nib started skipping. "Come sit with me," she used to say, and I would, cross-legged on the floor beside her desk, watching her work without fully understanding any of it, just enjoying the quiet, focused company of a woman who never once made me feel like I was in the way. Linda hated those Sunday afternoons. I understand that now in a way I didn't as a child. She'd stand in the doorway sometimes, arms crossed, and say something like, "Mom, she's 8, she doesn't need to see the books," and Evelyn would say, without looking up, "She's not doing anything wrong by watching Linda," and the 2 of them would have some quieter version of that same argument every few months, for years, without either of them ever fully winning it. When I got older, 12, 13, the invitation to sit by the desk quietly stopped coming. I didn't notice exactly when. I just noticed one Sunday that the office door was closed and that it mostly stayed closed after that, and that whenever I asked about the business, Linda would say some version of the same sentence. "That's an adult matter. Jessica understands it better than you do anyway." Jessica didn't understand it better than I did. Jessica understood correctly that being allowed into that room was a form of currency in our house, and she collected it the way she collected most things, not because she wanted the actual responsibility, but because having it meant Linda trusted her more than she trusted me. I used to feel, as a teenager, that being kept out of the business meant I wasn't as capable as my sister. I built a whole quiet resentment out of that assumption over the years, one I never fully said out loud to anyone, not even Emma. It took me until I was sitting in Priya's conference room with an operating agreement in my hands to understand the actual reason. Evelyn hadn't kept me out of the business because she doubted me. She'd kept me at arm's length from Linda's version of it on purpose, quietly building a separate plan for me that neither Linda nor Jessica were ever supposed to see coming until I turned 28. I didn't know any of that yet, standing in Emma's kitchen with my keys in my hand. I only knew that my grandmother had given me a blue box before she died, told me to keep it somewhere safe, and that my mother had apparently decided, 3 months before my birthday, that its contents needed to disappear from that house before I ever thought to ask for it back. We drove to the house that evening, my phone recording quietly in my jacket pocket, a habit Emma had insisted on the second I told her I was going back inside. "You don't have to say a word to them," she said in the passenger seat, watching the neighborhood slide by, the same stucco houses and citrus trees I'd grown up walking past. "But if anyone in that house says one more thing about money or that car, I want it on tape." The front door was unlocked. That, more than anything else, should have told me something before I even stepped inside. Linda locked that door before she went to bed every night of my childhood, an old habit from a break in 2 houses down when I was 9. An unlocked door at 7 in the evening meant somebody had been in and out recently and hadn't been careful about it. My bedroom, the room that still had, until 11 days ago, a decade-old bulletin board with my high school swim team ribbons pinned to it, had been emptied. Not cleaned. Emptied. My clothes were stuffed into 3 black trash bags lined up in the hallway like they were waiting for pickup, which I suppose they were. On top of the nearest bag sat a single sheet of paper in my mother's handwriting. First payment Sunday, 10% added Monday. I stood in that hallway for a moment, looking at my whole childhood room reduced to garbage bags and a threat written in blue ballpoint pen. And I felt something that surprised me, not the tears I'd have expected, but a strange, focused calm, the same calm I get right before a big client presentation, when all the nervous energy finally converts into something usable. I looked past the bags toward the garage. The hook by the side door, where the spare key to my car had hung for 3 years, was empty. I didn't ask anyone in that house whether my own family would really take my car. I already knew the answer. What I didn't know yet, what mattered more, standing in that hallway, was how much they were willing to risk to keep me from finding out what that invoice was actually built to hide. The blue box wasn't in my old closet. It wasn't in the hall closet either, or the garage, or any of the 3 places I checked before Linda appeared in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, watching me search my own childhood home like a stranger casing it. "What are you looking for?" she said, not a question, an accusation dressed as one. "Grandma's box." Something flickered across her face, there and gone so fast I might have imagined it if I hadn't been watching for it. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The blue metal one, with the latch. You told me 100 times it was clutter." "I got rid of a lot of things when we cleaned out the office," Linda said, and her voice had that particular smoothness she uses when she's decided a lie is going to be the version of events, going forward, whether or not anyone else agrees with it. "You should have taken it with you years ago if it mattered so much." I didn't argue. I'd learned in the last 18 hours that arguing with my mother inside her own house was a game designed for her to win, on her terms, with her audience. I picked up the 3 trash bags instead, carried them out to my car one at a time while she watched from the doorway without offering to help, and I drove away from that house for what I understood, even then, might be the last time in a long while. "She's lying about the box," Emma said, once we were back on the freeway, my 3 garbage bags of clothes filling the back seat like the world's saddest moving day. "Nobody gets rid of a dead woman's keepsake box during a routine cleanout and just happens to not remember it. She moved it. The question is where and why now?" I thought about that question for the rest of the drive, turning it over the way you turn over a puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit anywhere yet, sure that eventually you'll find the spot it belongs. Sunday arrived with no payment from me. I woke up at 6:40 that morning to the scrape of metal outside Emma's apartment window. I want to tell you I sat up calmly, assessed the situation, and executed a plan. That's not what happened. What happened is I looked out the window, still half asleep, and saw a flatbed tow truck backing slowly toward my silver Honda. A man in a reflective vest crouched by the rear bumper checking the license plate against a clipboard, while a second man stood near the driver's door holding a key I recognized instantly, because I'd bought it myself at a hardware store 2 years earlier as a spare. The key that had been missing from the hook in my parents' garage. For one full second, I simply watched, frozen, the particular paralysis of seeing something happen that your brain insists shouldn't be possible. Then the fear my mother had clearly been counting on, the fear that had kept generations of daughters compliant at family dinner tables, turned into something else. Something colder and considerably more useful. The second man near the driver's door was young, maybe 23. Wearing headphones around his neck like this was any other Sunday morning job. And something about his casual boredom made the whole scene feel even more surreal. Like my family's betrayal had been outsourced to a subcontractor who had absolutely no idea he was standing at the center of the worst morning of my year so far. I grabbed my title folder off Emma's kitchen counter, ran downstairs in yesterday's clothes, and started recording on my phone before I'd even reached the parking lot. "That's my car," I said, loud enough that both men turned. The driver, an older guy with a tired, unbothered expression that told me this was not his first uncomfortable tow, held up a form. "Ma'am, I've got a signed vehicle release. If you want to dispute it, that's between you and," he checked the paperwork, "Linda Sullivan, who's listed here as an authorized co-owner acting on behalf of Sullivan Property Holdings." I looked at that form over his shoulder while my phone kept recording. There was my name. There was a signature under it that was almost mine, the same general shape, the same loop on the S, but the middle initial was wrong. I don't have a middle initial. I've never had one. Whoever signed that release had invented one for me, in a hurry, and hadn't thought to check. Beneath it, a notary stamp with my Aunt Diane's name and commission number, alongside a photocopy of an insurance card so old the coverage dates had expired 3 years earlier. That's not my signature, I said, holding my current title up next to the form, my actual current insurance card beside it. This vehicle is privately owned. It has been for 3 years. I'd like you to call the police before you touch that car again. The driver looked at the two documents side by side for a long moment, then quietly stepped back from the vehicle, which told me he'd seen this particular kind of situation before and knew exactly which side of it he did not want to be standing on when the police arrived. The second man tried to hand me back the spare key and leave without another word, but I got a photo of his tow company badge before he managed to turn away. The officer who responded 20 minutes later was patient in a way I appreciated more than I expected to. He compared the release form to my title. He took my statement and the tow driver's and photographed the forged signature up close. Then he asked whether I wanted the incident documented as suspected fraud. Yes, I said. That single word felt different from every argument I'd ever lost at my parents' dinner table. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like revenge, not yet. It felt official, which turned out to be so much more powerful than dramatic ever could have been. Linda called while the officer was still crouched over his clipboard, writing up the report. I put her on speaker, mostly so Emma could hear it too. Why did you embarrass this family by calling the police over a misunderstanding? Linda said, before I'd even said hello. Why does my name appear on a release form I never saw or signed? A pause. Your father handled that. Then, without missing a beat, without a flicker of acknowledging what she'd just admitted. The interest has already started accruing, by the way. You should think about that. Michael called 30 seconds after she hung up, insisting Linda had handled all the paperwork herself. Their two stories had already split apart, without me even having to push, less than an hour after the tow truck backed out of the lot. Jessica texted that I was acting insane for involving the police. Diane sent a message warning that any future employer who ran a background check would see a police report and think I was unstable. I saved every single one of those messages into the growing folder without responding to any of them. Emma stood beside me on the sidewalk with the specific expression she used, back in high school, whenever a teacher had just contradicted their own earlier statement in front of the whole class. They handed you forgery, attempted conversion of stolen property, and 2 conflicting confessions before 9 in the morning, she said. Stop treating this like a family disagreement, Amber. This is a case. That afternoon, she introduced me to her supervising attorney. Priya Shah's office smelled like coffee and printer toner, and she had exactly the kind of unhurried, methodical energy I needed after a week of chaos. She didn't promise me revenge when I sat down across from her desk with my growing folder of screenshots and photographs. She promised me something that turned out to be far more frightening to people who'd survived their whole lives by controlling the story. Process. I learned, months later, once we'd worked together long enough that the professional distance between us had softened into something closer to real friendship, why she took cases like mine as personally as she did. Her own grandmother had lost a small restaurant in a dispute with a business partner decades earlier, a man the family had trusted, who'd used a poorly worded partnership agreement to slowly push her out of a business she'd built from nothing, one clause at a time, while everyone around her told her not to make a scene about it. Nobody fought for her the way I fight for my clients now, Priya told me once, late one evening, both of us still in her office long after everyone else had gone home. By the time anyone in our family understood what had actually happened, the restaurant was already gone. I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to watch that happen to someone else without at least trying to stop it. That context mattered to me more than I expected it to, sitting there. It helped me understand why Priya never once treated my case as merely a job, why she answered calls at odd hours, why she'd looked, more than once, genuinely angry on my behalf in moments I'd have expected only professional composure from her. She wasn't just building a case. She was quietly settling an old score of her own, one client at a time, in every room she ever walked into on someone else's behalf. She read through the invoice first, then the tow release form, then the texts, then the police report number I'd written on a sticky note. She didn't say much while she worked, just occasionally made a small, quiet sound, the sound of someone finding another loose thread in a sweater they intend to unravel completely. "Has your mother ever had power of attorney over you?" she asked finally, looking up. The question pulled open a memory I hadn't visited in almost a decade. When I was 19, I'd spent a semester studying overseas. Before I left, Linda had insisted I sign a limited authorization letting her renew my car registration if it came due while I was gone, a reasonable enough request, on its face, for a 19-year-old leaving the country for 4 months. I remembered my grandmother objecting, quietly but firmly, at the kitchen table where I'd signed it. I remembered Evelyn sliding a blue folder in front of me before I signed anything, and saying, in the particular calm voice she used when she wanted you to actually listen, "Read the ending of every document, Amber. People hide their real intentions in the parts they think you're too tired to read." I'd signed only after we'd both made sure the authorization was limited to 6 months. "That expired 9 years ago," Priya said, once I'd told her the story. "Legally, it can't support the release your mother used on that tow form, but it tells me something important. She knows how to use your name on paper when she wants to. She's done it before, in a small way, and gotten away with it. This time, she just needed more." "Should I confront her?" I asked, "call her, demand to know what's going on?" "Not yet," Priya said. "Not until we know what else your signature's been attached to that you don't know about." We spent that afternoon pulling my full credit reports and freezing my credit at all 3 bureaus, sending preservation notices to the tow company demanding they retain every document related to the release, and requesting anything connecting my name to Sullivan Property Holdings that existed in any public filing. Then I remembered the storage facility. Years earlier, before Evelyn got too sick to manage things herself, she'd kept a unit at a self-storage place off Main Street, full of old company records she trusted no one else to organize. I called the manager, half expecting the unit to have been cleaned out or transferred years ago. He remembered my grandmother by name. She'd apparently made an impression on him, the kind of woman who brought him donuts on her monthly visits. And after I verified my identity with the account number I still had saved from years back, he told me something that stopped me cold. A small blue metal box had been transferred out of that unit 3 months earlier, not to my mother, to a law office administering my grandmother's trust. Linda hadn't destroyed the box. She'd removed it from the house, quietly, 3 months before that dinner, because its contents apparently no longer belonged there. That was the first piece of good news I'd had in 8 days. It also came wrapped in a question that unsettled me more than the tow truck had. Why had my grandmother's trust attorney moved those records 3 months earlier, right around the time, I would later realize, that stood almost exactly 1 month before my 28th birthday? I want to tell you about the days in between, because it wasn't all confrontation and discovery. Most of it, honestly, was waiting, and waiting turned out to be its own particular kind of hard. I had 2 interviews scheduled that week for the regional strategy position, and I almost canceled both of them. Emma talked me out of it, sitting across from me at her kitchen table the night before the first one, watching me stare at a blazer I'd laid out on her guest bed like it belonged to a stranger. "You don't get to let them take this too," she said. "The job interview isn't part of their story. Don't let it become one." I went. I sat across from a hiring panel of 3 people who had no idea that 4 hours earlier I'd been on the phone with a bank's fraud department, and I answered their questions about market positioning and client retention in a voice that, to my own surprise, didn't shake once. There's a strange clarity that comes from having already survived the worst conversation of your week before 9 in the morning. Everything after that starts to feel almost manageable by comparison. I got a follow-up call 2 days later. Not an offer yet, but a second round, and I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage afterward, phone still warm in my hand, crying for the first time in nearly a week, not from grief this time, just from the release of proof, small as it was, that my actual life was still moving forward underneath everything else trying to collapse it. Priya called that same afternoon with an update on the credit freeze. All 3 bureaus had confirmed it was active. No new inquiries had come through since. It should have felt like relief, and it did, briefly, until she added one more sentence, almost as an afterthought. "There was a soft inquiry 2 weeks before your dinner," she said, "from a mortgage broker in Orange County. It didn't result in a hard pull, so it's not something we can act on directly, but I want you to know it's there." Somebody was checking, quietly, what kind of financing might be available using your credit profile before they ever sat you down at that table. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. 2 weeks before the dinner, before I'd even packed my bag to come home. Whatever had been building inside that house, it hadn't started the night my mother slid a spreadsheet across the table. It had started weeks earlier, in a conversation I hadn't been part of, between people deciding, in advance, exactly how useful I was about to become to them. Emma found me still sitting on her couch an hour later, staring at nothing in particular. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just sat down next to me, put a blanket over both our laps like we were 14 again, staying up too late on a school night, and said, "Whatever it is, we're going to have paperwork for it by tomorrow." That became, without either of us ever naming it out loud, the actual rhythm of that whole strange month. Something would land, a discovery, a threat, a bill, a lie unraveling, and instead of letting it knock me flat, Emma and I would simply add it to the folder, give it a place to live that wasn't inside my chest, and keep moving. I don't think I could have survived that month without learning, piece by piece, that grief and strategy could sit in the same room together, as long as I let myself feel, both instead of choosing one and pretending the other wasn't there. The answer started arriving in fragments the following Tuesday. My credit report, freshly pulled after the freeze, showed no new credit cards opened in my name, a small relief, but it listed one recent hard inquiry I hadn't authorized. A commercial credit inquiry from Pacific Horizon Bank. I had never applied for anything at Pacific Horizon Bank in my life. Priya called their fraud department with me on the line, and though the representative couldn't disclose full account details without a subpoena, she confirmed one thing that made my stomach drop somewhere below the floor of Priya's office. My social security number had been submitted as part of a commercial credit file connected to Sullivan Property Holdings. I sat very still in that chair, and I realized I wasn't surprised anymore, not really. What I felt instead was the specific, cold recognition of a countdown. Someone at that bank knew a renewal or an audit was coming. Someone needed $29,840 before that review happened. The invoice wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a deadline, wearing a family dinner as a disguise. That evening, at 7:03, Linda texted me a photograph, the empty hook in the garage where the spare key used to hang, with the message, "Last chance. Bring the money home and we can forget today." I looked at that photo for a long time. Then, at the police report, sitting on Emma's kitchen table beside it. Had they genuinely believed family loyalty meant I would help them erase the evidence of what they'd already done. I typed 6 words back, "Do not contact my vehicle again." Then I blocked every number in that house except one. Jessica's, I left open, deliberately, for a reason I couldn't have fully explained yet, except that some part of me understood my sister differently than I understood the rest of them. Jessica loved being close to power far more than she loved being right. She'd never quite learned how to stay composed when the ground under that power started to shift. If something inside that house cracked before the rest of us saw it coming, I was fairly certain she'd be the first to tell me, even if she framed it as a betrayal of everyone else while she did it. I was right, it just took a little longer than I expected. Monday morning, Priya's office received the transferred trust file. She set the blue document box on her conference table without opening it first and asked whether I wanted a witness present when I did. Emma sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on the table between us, not touching me, just there, the way it had been there in 10th grade whenever a test result came back and I needed someone steady in the room. I lifted the lid. On top sat a single cream envelope in my grandmother's careful, slanted handwriting. For Amber, when she is 28. I want to be honest with you, I expected a letter. A sentimental note, maybe some old photographs, a piece of jewelry she'd wanted me to have. That's what blue box, sentimental clutter had always meant in my family's shorthand, repeated so many times over the years that I'd half believed it myself. It was not sentimental clutter. Underneath the envelope sat an operating agreement, an amendment to the Evelyn Sullivan Family Trust, and a detailed schedule of ownership interests in Sullivan Property Holdings. My grandmother had owned 60% of that company, Linda owned 20%, Michael owned 10%, Jessica owned the remaining 10%. Under the amendment, dated, I noticed, 9 years earlier, right around the time of that overseas semester and the expired power of attorney, Evelyn's 60% transferred automatically to me on my 28th birthday. Along with it came the right to appoint the company's managing member and to demand a full, independent accounting of every transaction made during Linda's temporary management. The family home wasn't Linda and Michael's personal property. It never had been. It belonged to the company. So did 2 rental units across town and the commercial kitchen Linda used for her small catering business. I read the same paragraph 3 times before its full weight actually settled into my chest. My mother had demanded 4 years of back rent from me, inside a house owned by a company I now held majority control of. She had threatened to seize my personal car using that same company's letterhead. And she had done it exactly 5 days before her authority to manage any of it was scheduled, by a document she apparently didn't know I had, to legally expire. The second envelope held Evelyn's letter, and it was short. She wrote that Linda was capable and ambitious and easily frightened by the idea of losing control of anything. She wrote that Michael avoided conflict for so long that avoidance had quietly become its own form of participation. She wrote that Jessica had been raised to mistake proximity to authority for actually earning it. Then she wrote, "You may be tempted to rescue them the moment the truth arrives. Do not rescue anyone before the books are opened." I sat in that conference room and felt, for one strange, weightless second, like my grandmother had reached across 3 years of silence and put a steady hand on my shoulder exactly when I needed it most. Old memories rearranged themselves as I sat there. Linda locking the office door on holidays when I was a kid. Diane carrying stacks of blank invoice books out to her car after Thanksgiving one year, an image I'd filed away as unremarkable and never thought about again. Jessica boasting, more than once, about a consulting fee the company paid her for work I'd never actually seen her do. And underneath all of it, quietly, my grandmother building a lock none of them could pick, years before any of us understood we'd need one. Priya opened the accounting schedule attached to the trust amendment. Under its terms, an independent financial review was required within 10 business days of the ownership transfer. A certified notice had already been mailed, automatically, by the trust's administering attorney, to the company's registered address, which happened to be my parents' own house, informing Linda that her signing authority would end at midnight that Friday. A second packet, following close behind it, would require the delivery of every bank statement, lease, vendor contract, and tax record the company held for review. That was the mail Jessica would later mention to me at 1 a.m, though none of us knew it yet, sitting in that quiet conference room. But before that packet even arrived, we needed to understand exactly what the review was going to find. I called the trust attorney myself that same afternoon, a careful, soft-spoken man named Gerald Ockhafer who'd handled my grandmother's estate for over a decade, because I needed to understand why he'd moved that box 3 months before my birthday, and why he hadn't simply mailed it to me directly instead of routing it through his own office first. "Your grandmother's instructions were specific," he told me, once he'd confirmed my identity. "She wanted the box held at our office starting 90 days before the transfer date, released to you only in person, with a witness present. She was very particular about that detail. I asked her about it once, a few years before she passed, and she told me something I've thought about more than once since." "What did she say?" "She said, if I leave it in that house, my daughter will find a reason to lose it." I sat with that sentence for a long moment, the phone warm against my ear, and I asked him the question I hadn't quite let myself ask anyone yet. Had this happened before, something like this, with Linda? There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a lawyer deciding how much he's actually allowed to say. "I can tell you what's a matter of record," he said finally. "There was an earlier version of your grandmother's estate plan, drafted about 15 years ago, that would have left Linda a much larger ownership share, with full authority, no delayed transfer, no independent accounting requirement. Your grandmother rewrote that plan entirely about a year after a dispute involving a joint account she'd shared with your mother during a difficult stretch in your mother's finances. I don't have authorization to tell you the specifics of that dispute. I can tell you that your grandmother described it to me, at the time, as the moment she stopped being able to fully trust her daughter with anything she couldn't verify herself. I thought about that for days afterward. A difficult stretch in Linda's finances, 15 years earlier, I would have been 13, around the exact age the office door had quietly stopped being open to me. I never learned every detail of what happened in that dispute, and I decided eventually that I didn't need to. What mattered was the shape of it. My grandmother hadn't built this trust out of some abstract fear of the future. She'd built it because she'd already watched, once before, exactly what her daughter was capable of doing with access she hadn't fully earned. And she'd spent the next 15 years quietly making sure it couldn't happen again to someone with less power to stop it than she'd had. "There's one more thing," Gerald said before we hung up. She left a standing instruction with our office, updated every few years right up until she passed, that if anyone other than you ever inquired about the contents of that box or attempted to gain access to it, we were to notify you directly and document the inquiry. I want you to know that happened. Twice. My stomach went cold. When? The first time, about 8 months ago. The second time, 6 weeks before your birthday. He paused. Both inquiries came from your mother. I hung up the phone and sat very still in Priya's office, understanding for the first time the full shape of the timeline. Linda hadn't invented the invoice at that dinner table in a sudden fit of anger. She'd been circling this exact date for the better part of a year, trying different doors, long before she ever slid a spreadsheet across a table and called it back rent. She knew the transfer was coming, I said out loud, mostly to myself. She's known for months, maybe longer. Priya looked up from the file she was reviewing. Then the dinner wasn't the beginning of this, Amber. It was the last resort. Everything else had already failed. Pacific Horizon Bank released the full commercial file 2 days later, once our fraud affidavit gave them legal cover to do it. The application sought renewal of a $180,000 business line of credit. My name appeared on it twice, once as a personal guarantor, and once as an incoming majority member of the company, a designation that meant the bank had somehow already learned about my grandmother's transfer before I had. The electronic consent for the loan had been submitted from my parents' home internet address. Diane had notarized a supporting identity certification for me that I had never signed or witnessed. Jessica had signed as company secretary. Michael had signed a resolution stating that all members had approved the renewal. Linda had signed everything else, listing herself as managing member. The bank hadn't yet funded the renewal, the representative told Priya, because their internal policy required a final confirmation after the date listed for the ownership transfer, my birthday. Sitting in Priya's office with that file spread across the table, I finally understood the whole shape of the trap, all at once, the way a photograph resolves out of static. Present me as broke and desperate at the dinner table. Demand $30,000 immediately, framed as something I owed rather than something they needed. Pressure me into signing whatever document came next, whatever they'd have handed me the moment I agreed to settle the debt. Use my payment to quietly cover a shortage in the company's books before the bank's review looked too closely at where the money had actually gone. And if I resisted, take the car, sell it fast, and call the proceeds a family contribution nobody would ever be asked to itemize. The invoice hadn't just been cruel. It had been a financial trap, dressed up in dinner theater, timed to a deadline they thought I'd never know existed. "What outcome do you want?" Priya asked me, once she'd laid the whole picture out. The question should have been easy. It wasn't, and I want to be honest about that because I think it's the part of this story people relate to most. My first instinct, sitting in that office with proof of everything they'd done spread out in front of me, was still to minimize the damage. Protect Michael from Linda's temper. Excuse Jessica as young and easily led. Assume Diane had only ever followed instructions she didn't fully understand. That instinct, the one that kept apologizing for people who'd never once apologized to me, was exactly the thing that had kept their whole system running for 28 years. I thought about my grandmother's line, "Do not rescue anyone before the books are opened." I want the company secured, I said. I want every account frozen against unauthorized transfers. I want a full, independent audit. And I don't want anyone warned beyond what the trust legally requires. We appointed an independent property manager that afternoon. We notified every bank connected to the company of the ownership change. We formally revoked Linda's authority, effective the moment the trust allowed it. And Priya sent a written demand prohibiting the sale, transfer, or destruction of any company asset, sent by courier to the house directly, timed to arrive before Friday's deadline. I didn't call home. I didn't need to, not yet. That same afternoon, I got the call I'd actually been waiting for, the regional strategy job, an offer, better than I'd hoped for. Emma and I ate takeout sitting on her living room floor that night because her kitchen table was buried under case files. And for one evening, at least, I let myself celebrate something my family hadn't managed to redefine yet. At 12:54 the following Saturday morning, according to the courier's tracking alert, the certified packet was finally delivered after several earlier failed attempts. 6 minutes later, my phone lit up on Emma's coffee table. "Dude, Mom found something in the mail and she's screaming. Please answer." I watched the typing bubbles appear under that text and disappear, 3 separate times, before Jessica finally managed to finish whatever she was trying to say. At 1:09, a photograph came through. The first page of the trust notice, the one informing Linda that her management authority was set to terminate. My mother had underlined the phrase termination of management authority so hard with a pen that the paper had actually torn beneath it, a small, ragged gash right through the legal language she couldn't argue her way around. At 1:23, Diane texted, the first message from her in days that wasn't a warning or an insult. "Your mom and dad are here sobbing. Please call them back." Michael left a voicemail a few minutes later, his voice thin and rehearsed, saying there had clearly been some kind of misunderstanding about Grandma's paperwork. Linda's voicemail came right after his, and hers had a different tone entirely, brisk, businesslike, already negotiating. She said we could work out the rent situation if I came home immediately tonight, before anyone else got involved. Not one of them in any of those messages said the words I actually needed to hear. "We used your name. We lied to you. We tried to take something that wasn't ours." I didn't answer any of it. I sat on Emma's couch with my phone in my lap, watching the messages keep coming, Diane now, warning that a public scene would humiliate everyone, Michael again, asking if we could just talk like a family, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet, this early in the unraveling. Not triumph, something quieter and stranger. A kind of grief for the family I'd apparently never actually had dressed up for 28 years as one I did. At 1:41, Jessica finally sent the message I'd been half expecting since I left her number unblocked. "There are things in the office Mom doesn't want the auditors to see." I typed back immediately, "Do not touch them, take pictures and leave the room." I want to explain why I told her that because it might look, from the outside, like I was protecting her or trusting her, and it wasn't really either of those things. I understood my sister well enough to know that Jessica's loyalty had never been to Linda specifically. It was to whoever currently held the most power in the room. For 28 years, that had always been our mother. That night, at 1:41 in the morning, with a legal notice tearing under our mother's own pen on the kitchen table, Jessica was recalculating, in real time, exactly whose side the power was actually on. 3 minutes later, my phone filled with photographs, ledgers with pages torn out, a trash bag full of shredded paper sitting open in the corner of the home office, as if someone had started destroying documents and then panicked and stopped. Vendor invoices bearing Diane's small maintenance company's letterhead, dated for work I'd later learn had never actually been performed. And on the last page Jessica sent, a handwritten column of figures, tallied by hand, showing a deficit, $29,840. The exact amount they had invoiced me at that dinner table, down to the dollar. Not a coincidence. It was the hole they'd wanted me to fill, voluntarily, out of guilt and family obligation, before I ever got the chance to inherit the right to look inside and see it for myself. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat with Emma at her kitchen table, the shredded paper photograph enlarged on her laptop screen, and I understood that whatever was waiting for me at that house on Friday morning was going to be bigger and uglier than a single fraudulent invoice. Friday morning, I went back to the house with Priya, a forensic accountant she'd worked with before named Daniel Cho, and the independent property manager we'd appointed that week. I hadn't been inside since the night I'd carried my life out in 3 black trash bags. Linda was waiting in the doorway when we pulled into the driveway, standing exactly the way she used to stand when I came home past curfew as a teenager, arms crossed, chin lifted, already certain of her own righteousness before anyone had said a word. She held up the original invoice, as if it still meant something, as if a piece of paper she'd fabricated herself could function as a legal barrier. "She's not entering until she pays what she owes," she announced, loud enough that I saw 2 neighbors pause on their own front lawns, watching over their fences with the specific, unhurried interest of people who had clearly heard rumors already and were delighted to finally see the show in person. Priya stepped forward and handed her the operating agreement, calm, unhurried, the way you'd hand someone a menu. She explained, in a clear, carrying voice pitched exactly loud enough for the neighbors to hear too, that I was entering as the majority owner of the company that legally owned the property in front of us. Linda's face didn't collapse the way I half expected it to. It hardened instead into something colder and more familiar, and she turned toward the yard, toward her audience, and delivered the line I think she'd been rehearsing since the truck notice tore under her pen 3 days earlier. She manipulated her dying grandmother into stealing the family home, she said, loud enough to carry across 2 lawns. That accusation told me more than any apology ever could have. She wasn't ashamed of what she'd done. She was ashamed, purely and simply, that she'd lost control of the audience watching her do it. I stepped past her without raising my voice, because I understood, standing on that porch, that raising my voice was exactly the reaction she needed from me to make her own story land. Inside, 3 of the 4 filing cabinets in the office stood empty. The company laptop had been factory reset. Daniel Cho would confirm that within the hour, watching the machine boot up to a set-up screen like it had never held a single file. Several bankers' boxes that should have held years of paper records were simply gone. Jessica sat on the staircase, eyes swollen, insisting over and over that she'd only ever signed documents because Linda told her they were routine. Michael stood in the hallway repeating, in the same flat, rehearsed voice from his voicemail, that he'd never really understood the company's finances, that Linda had always handled that side of things. Diane, arriving 20 minutes later, uninvited, claimed that notarizing my identity certificate without me physically present had simply been a harmless family shortcut. The kind of thing, she said, everyone in this business did. Daniel Cho started with the bank statements Jessica had photographed at 1 a.m, and he worked fast, in the quiet, focused way of someone who'd clearly done this exact kind of forensic reconstruction more times than he could count. Within 2 hours, he'd found payments to Diane's small maintenance company for repairs that at least one tenant swore, when he called to confirm, had never actually happened. Monthly consulting transfers to Jessica for work nobody in the company could produce a single deliverable for. Catering expenses from Linda's business charged directly to the property accounts. Cash withdrawals, approved jointly by Linda and Michael, with no corresponding invoice or explanation attached to any of them. The missing $29,840, the number they'd invoiced me, turned out to be only the amount that had come due before the bank's renewal deadline. The preliminary total of everything unexplained, once Daniel finished his first pass, exceeded $137,000. Linda's response, once the number was said out loud in that ransacked office, was to turn it on everyone else in the room. Jessica was ungrateful. Michael was weak. Diane had overbilled without her knowledge. I had abandoned the family the moment things got difficult. Even Evelyn, 3 years dead, had apparently set some cruel, calculated trap from beyond the grave, designed, in Linda's telling, purely to humiliate her only living daughter. Listening to her cycle through every possible target except herself, I finally understood the actual architecture of the family I'd grown up inside. Linda created emergencies. She assigned guilt for those emergencies to whoever was standing closest, and then she offered belonging back as the reward for obedience, over and over, for as long as anyone let her. The invoice at that dinner table hadn't been some new low. It had simply been the first time she'd ever printed the whole system out on paper and handed it directly to the one person capable of reading it correctly. Priya asked each of them formally to preserve every device and document in their possession. Linda refused and reached for the office laptop sitting on the desk between us, as if she could still, even now, simply take back control of the room by force of habit. The property manager stepped between her and the desk before she reached it. That was when Michael cracked, quietly, almost apologetically. He admitted the missing banker's boxes of records were sitting in Diane's garage, moved there, he said, 3 days earlier. Diane spun on him immediately. "You agreed to help me move them." Jessica, still on the stairs, added her own piece before anyone could stop the momentum. "Mom told me to delete the company emails before the audit. Last week. I didn't do it yet." Their alliance came apart in less than 5 minutes, right there in that stripped office, because I understood, finally, that it had never actually been loyalty holding any of them together. It had only ever been shared protection from consequences, and the moment consequences became unavoidable, none of them had any reason left to protect each other. Daniel found one more thing that morning, almost by accident, buried in a folder labeled MISC on the Reset laptop's cloud backup, which he'd managed to pull before Linda ever got near the device. A draft deed transfer, prepared 6 weeks before that dinner, moving partial ownership of the family home directly to Michael's name using the same expired power of attorney Linda had once invoked for my car registration at 19. It had never been filed. Daniel's best guess, once he cross-referenced the dates, was that it had been a contingency. A second, quieter plan, prepared in case the invoice failed to produce the money fast enough, or in case I refused outright and they needed some other asset to leverage against the coming deadline at the bank. They had a backup plan for taking something else if you didn't fold, Priya said quietly once Daniel showed us the file. "Amber, I want you to understand what that means. This wasn't a single bad decision made under pressure at one dinner. This was a structure. Multiple contingencies, prepared in advance in case one approach didn't work." I stood in that office holding a printed copy of a deed that had never been filed, for a house that, as it turned out, had never belonged to any of them to transfer in the first place. And I felt the last soft edge of doubt I'd still been carrying, the part of me that had wanted, right up until that exact moment, to believe this had all been one desperate, unplanned mistake, finally give way completely. I could have let the lawyers take it from there. Instead, I placed the original invoice down beside Daniel's deficit ledger, the 2 numbers sitting side by side, and I asked my mother one question. "When you looked at me across that table," I said, "did you see your daughter? Or did you see $30,000? For once in my entire life, she had no prepared answer waiting. Michael started crying. Jessica stared at the floor. Diane muttered that the question wasn't fair. Linda finally said, "I saw someone who owed this family everything." That answer removed the last piece of doubt I'd been carrying quietly without even fully admitting it to myself. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to, letting the silence stretch, letting all 4 of them sit inside it the way I'd once had to sit inside theirs at that dinner table 11 days earlier. Nobody moved to fill it this time. I told them the terms then, standing in that half-empty office with the morning light coming through the same window I used to do my homework by. Linda's management authority was permanently revoked. Jessica's consulting role ended immediately. Diane's vendor contracts were suspended and formally reported for review. Michael's access to every company account was frozen. The house itself would be evaluated separately because company funds had apparently been subsidizing their private household expenses for years. If they cooperated, I told them, the civil process could stay orderly. If they destroyed records, transferred assets, contacted tenants directly, or came near my car again, we would seek emergency court orders and refer everything we already had to the appropriate agencies. Linda laughed, once sharp and disbelieving. I would never do that to my own mother. "You tried to sell my car before Sunday breakfast," I said. "Don't confuse restraint with permission." 2 days after that Friday, the independent property manager sent me a list of every tenant currently renting from the company, along with a note flagging one name in particular, a woman named Sandra Whitlow, who'd been in the smaller Birch Street rental for almost 6 years, and who had, according to the manager, called 3 times that week, asking increasingly anxious questions about whether the new owners knew about the cash arrangement. I called her myself that evening instead of letting the property manager handle it, because something about the phrase cash arrangement had caught in my chest like a hook. Sandra was cautious at first, the careful, clipped voice of someone who'd learned not to trust authority figures with anything that might come back to bite her. It took me almost 10 minutes of plain, patient honesty, telling her exactly who I was, exactly what had happened at that dinner table, exactly why the company's management had changed, before she finally let her guard down. "Your mother's been collecting half my rent in cash for 4 years," she said. "$300 a month, off the books," she called it, in exchange for not raising the rent to match the market rate like she was supposed to every year. I never got a receipt. I never asked for one because I needed the discount more than I needed the paperwork, and she made it real clear, real early on, that the deal only worked if I never mentioned it to anyone. "Do you have anything?" I asked. "Any record at all, even a text message?" There was a long pause. "I kept every single one," Sandra said. "I'm not proud of that arrangement, but I always had a feeling, somewhere in the back of my mind, that someday somebody was going to ask me exactly this question." She emailed the texts to Priya that same night, 4 years of casual, damning messages in which my mother confirmed, in her own words, an arrangement that meant company income never made it onto a single one of the books Daniel Cho was now combing through. It wasn't a fortune, $300 a month over 4 years, but it was one more thread in a pattern that was quickly stopping looking like carelessness and starting to look like a habit, practiced and deliberate, of quietly keeping money moving in directions nobody but Linda could see. "This matters more than the dollar amount," Priya told me once she'd reviewed it. "It shows intent. It shows a pattern that predates your invoice by years. And Amber, it shows us there are probably other tenants out there who know things they've been too scared to say out loud. I think we should reach out to a few more carefully and see what else surfaces." We found 2 more within the week. Neither arrangement was as extensive as Sandra's, but both confirmed the same basic shape: small, off-book concessions, offered quietly, in exchange for silence, by a woman who apparently understood, long before I ever did, that the people with the least power in any given room are often the ones most willing to help you hide something, if you make staying quiet worth their while. I thought about that for a long time afterward. My mother hadn't just been careless with a company's books. She'd built a small, private economy of favors and silence, running parallel to the real one, for years, and none of us, not me, not Jessica, probably not even Michael, had ever once been let close enough to see it clearly. I visited Sandra in person the following week, mostly to reassure her that her rent wouldn't change under the new management, and that nothing she'd shared would ever come back to hurt her standing as a tenant. Her apartment was small and immaculately kept, photographs of grandchildren covering nearly every wall, and she made me tea I didn't really want but drank anyway because refusing felt, somehow, like it would undo the trust it had taken her 10 minutes to build with me on the phone. "I want you to know something," she said, sitting across from me at her kitchen table, a table not unlike the one my own confrontation had started at, though everything about the feeling in that room was different. "Your grandmother used to come by herself every few months back before she got sick. Never sent anyone else. She'd check on the plumbing, ask about my kids by name, remembered my late husband's birthday better than some of my own relatives did." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I always wondered what happened to that. Why it turned into phone calls from a manager I never met and cash deals nobody wanted written down. I think I know now." "I'm sorry it took this long for someone to ask," I told her. "Don't be sorry," Sandra said. "Just don't let it go back to how it was. That's the only thing I actually want from any of this." I promised her it wouldn't, and I meant it in a way that turned out to matter more to me, over the following months, than almost anything the courtroom eventually handed down. She slapped the invoice flat against the desk and told me she'd make sure every relative, every client, and every neighbor on that street knew exactly what I'd done. Come home from San Francisco, she said, to seize a sick woman's business out from under her. I told her to say whatever she wanted, because the audit was going to tell the actual story, with actual dates, actual signatures, and actual bank transfers attached to it. That evening, the campaign began exactly as promised. Family group chats I wasn't part of anymore, but that Jessica screenshotted for me anyway in a burst of what I think was genuine guilt, filled up with messages calling me greedy, ungrateful, cold. Linda posted something on her personal social media, vague enough to avoid naming me directly but specific enough that everyone who knew our family understood exactly who it was about. A long paragraph about being evicted by the child she'd sacrificed everything for. Diane called at least 3 cousins directly and told them I'd forged the trust documents myself. Jessica didn't post anything publicly, but she texted me privately, twice, begging to be excluded from whatever came next in the audit. Michael asked me to delay the whole process until Linda settled down. I answered none of them. Instead, Priya sent one carefully worded, entirely factual notice to every company member and every tenant. Management had changed hands. Rent and repairs would continue exactly as normal. Financial records were currently under independent review. The contrast between the two approaches turned out to be devastating, in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. Linda had volume, loud, emotional, everywhere at once. I had documentation. By the following Monday, 2 relatives had independently forwarded me messages in which my mother had admitted, in her own words, that she'd needed my payment specifically because the bank was starting to look too closely. A former tenant sent Priya photographs of repairs she'd paid for entirely out of her own pocket, despite Diane's maintenance company having billed the property for that exact work. The harder Linda pushed to destroy my reputation, the more witnesses, unprompted, started coming forward on their own. The kind of revenge I'd imagined, somewhere in the angriest hours of that first sleepless night, had been loud and satisfying and immediate. What I got instead turned out to be quieter and considerably more thorough. I stopped protecting the lie, and the truth, left alone, began recruiting its own allies without any help from me at all. Consequences, I learned that fall, rarely arrive as one single dramatic explosion. They arrive as appointments, deadlines, canceled contracts, letters that, unlike a person, can't be shouted into disappearing. Pacific Horizon Bank formally denied the credit renewal within the week and referred the falsified identity documents for their own internal investigation. Without that line of credit, Linda's catering business lost its access to the commercial kitchen almost overnight, because the account had quietly accumulated months of unpaid company charges nobody had bothered mentioning to her clients. 2 of her larger contracts canceled within days of each other. Once word got around that deposits had been routed through accounts currently under legal review. Daniel chose completed audit, delivered 5 weeks later in a report thick enough that Priya had it spiral bound before handing me a copy, identified $164,300 in unauthorized payments, undocumented personal expenses, unsupported vendor billing, and unexplained cash withdrawals, spread across nearly 4 years. Some of that money had gone toward keeping Linda's catering business afloat during a slow stretch 2 years earlier. Some had covered Jessica's credit card balances and what turned out to be a pair of vacations disguised in the books as marketing research trips. A significant portion had moved through Diane's maintenance company, a business that, Daniel discovered, had never actually employed a single licensed contractor. Michael, for his part, had signed quarterly financial statements every year certifying that he'd personally reviewed and approved transactions he now claimed, under oath, not to fully understand. The final report didn't leave room for any of them to disappear behind the word family. It assigned names, dates, dollar amounts, direct responsibility. Diane's notary complaint, filed formally with the county, was upheld within a month. Her commission was revoked. The property company terminated every remaining contract with her business, and the insurer who'd covered her maintenance work opened its own separate review into every job she'd billed for over the past 3 years. Jessica lost her consulting income immediately, and then, several weeks later, lost a job offer from a local brokerage entirely. She called me the night it happened, crying so hard I could barely understand the first few sentences, and told me the hiring manager had asked her, point blank, in a final interview, whether she had any ongoing involvement in a company currently under audit for fraud. She'd said no. It wasn't true, and the background check that followed made that plain within days. Pulling her name off the trust filings Priya's office had already made a matter of public record. "You could have just told them the truth," I said, and I remember how strange it felt, saying that particular sentence to my sister, given everything. "The truth would have cost me the job too," she said. "Maybe," I said, "but a lie that gets discovered costs you the job and your credibility. At least the truth only costs you the job." She didn't have an answer for that, and I understood, listening to her cry on the other end of the line, that some part of her still hadn't fully absorbed the actual lessons sitting underneath everything that had happened to our family that year. That the truth, however uncomfortable, had turned out to be the only strategy in this entire story that had actually held up under pressure, every single time it had been tested. She moved out of the family home not long after, and began, in the group chats she didn't realize Jessica herself had shown me, blaming Linda publicly for everything, while continuing, privately, to text me that I'd ruined her life. It told me she'd changed sides. It did not, I noticed, tell me she'd changed at all. Michael agreed to cooperate fully with the civil case, surrendered his 10% company interest toward restitution, and moved into a small one-bedroom apartment after separating from Linda that winter. He asked me once, on the phone, whether I could describe him publicly as someone who'd been manipulated rather than someone who'd participated. I told him manipulation might explain the very first signature. It didn't explain the dozens that came after it. Linda fought every single step. She challenged the validity of the trust in court and lost. She filed a formal complaint accusing Daniel Cho of professional bias, which went nowhere. She accused Priya, in writing, of intimidating her during our meetings, a complaint the state bar dismissed within weeks. Every attempt failed, and every failed attempt added to her own mounting legal bills. Most damaging of all, she kept using company money even after her authority had been formally, legally revoked, transferring $18,000 out of a shared account the morning after the audit officially began, apparently gambling that nobody would notice quickly enough to stop her. I heard about the first canceled contract from Jessica, of all people, who apparently still couldn't resist narrating our mother's unraveling to me even while insisting, in the same breath, that she wanted nothing to do with any of it. A bride named Courtney Alvarez had booked Linda's catering business for a wedding 8 months out, a sizable contract, 6 figures including the venue partnership Linda had arranged on the side. Courtney's mother, it turned out, worked at a bank 2 branches down from Pacific Horizon, and had heard, through the particular efficient gossip network that exists among people who work in finance in a small enough radius, that Sullivan Property Holdings was under review for fraud. She called Linda directly, according to Jessica, and asked, plainly, whether any of the deposit money was safe. "My mom lost it," Jessica told me, her voice doing the thing it always did when she was somewhere between reporting facts and secretly enjoying them. She told Courtney's mom it was a family misunderstanding, totally unrelated to the business, nothing to worry about. Courtney's mom asked for a full refund of the deposit that same afternoon. Mom didn't have it. It had already gone into the account that got frozen. 2 more clients followed within a month, each cancellation quieter than the last, each one another small, specific consequence Linda hadn't accounted for when she decided, months earlier, that the fastest way to cover a shortfall was to invoice her own daughter for rent that had never existed. Diane's unraveling moved slower, but it moved with its own kind of relentlessness. The insurer covering her maintenance business assigned an investigator to review every job she'd billed the company for over the past 3 years, and within 6 weeks, that investigator had found the same pattern Daniel Cho had already documented: invoices for work that either hadn't happened at all or had been performed by an unlicensed relative of Diane's paid in cash, far below what the company's books claimed the job had cost. The insurer dropped her policy entirely. Without it, she couldn't legally take on new maintenance contracts anywhere in the county, and word travels fast enough, in a business built on referrals, that within a year she'd stopped advertising the company altogether. I want to be honest with you about something, sitting here telling you all of this. I didn't feel triumphant hearing about any of it, not the way I might have expected to, back at that dinner table with a fake invoice in front of me. Mostly what I felt was a kind of tired, sad clarity, watching an entire structure of small dishonesties, built patiently over years by people I'd once trusted completely, finally collapse under the simple weight of being looked at directly for the first time. I found out about the $18,000 transfer the same way I'd found out about almost everything else in this story, from a text Jessica probably shouldn't have sent me, forwarded from a banking alert Linda had left visible on the kitchen counter. Priya filed for an emergency order within the hour, and we were in front of a judge by Thursday morning, in a courtroom that smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee, waiting on a wooden bench outside for our case to be called while Linda's attorney, a heavy-set man named Gordon Aldies, who kept glancing at his phone like he had somewhere better to be, tried to negotiate a delay in the hallway. My client is under considerable emotional distress, he told Priya, loud enough for me to hear from 3 feet away. Surely we can find a version of this that doesn't require freezing every account she has access to. Your client transferred $18,000 out of a company account 4 days after being served written notice that her authority had ended, Priya said, not unkindly, just flatly, the way you'd correct a typo. I'm not sure what version of that you're picturing, Gordon, but I promise you it isn't the one we're asking the judge for. Inside, Judge Marcus felt read through the filing with the particular unhurried patience of someone who has seen a great many families do a great many foolish things to each other, and has stopped being surprised by any of it. He asked Linda directly, from the bench, why the transfer had occurred after the date listed on the notice she'd already signed for. I needed it for legitimate business expenses, she said. Payroll, utilities. Ms. Sullivan, the judge said, I have a bank statement in front of me showing that $18,000 moved into a personal savings account opened 4 days prior to this transfer, in your name alone, at a different institution than the company's primary bank. I'm going to need you to help me understand which utility company accepts a wire transfer of that size into someone's personal savings. Linda didn't have an answer. I watched her search for one anyway, the way I'd watched her search for one at that dinner table, at the tow truck, in the ransacked office, that same half-second pause where I could almost see her building the story in real time, testing it silently before she said it out loud. She didn't get the chance to finish building it. The judge granted the order in full, freezing the new account, barring her permanently from managing, selling, transferring, or encumbering any company asset, and requiring the full $18,000 returned within 10 business days. I understand this is painful for you, the judge added, as she stood there in the well of the courtroom, her composure finally, visibly cracking at the edges. But I want to be clear about something, for the record. A court order isn't a suggestion, and it isn't a starting point for negotiation. It's the floor. What happens to you next depends entirely on whether you understand that difference. I didn't say anything on the drive home. I didn't need to. For the first time since that dinner table, I watched someone else, someone with a robe and a gavel and absolutely no personal stake in our family's history, tell my mother, plainly, in a room full of strangers, that she didn't get to write the rules anymore. There was one piece of all this that never fully folded into the civil case, and it was the piece that had started everything. The forged signature on the tow release form, and the notary stamp Diane had attached to it without ever actually witnessing my identity. Detective Alan Ray's, no relation to Emma, a coincidence that made us both laugh. Quietly, the first time we realized it, had been assigned to the original fraud report from that Sunday morning. And he called me in for a follow-up interview about 6 weeks after the audit's preliminary findings went public within the family. I want to walk you through what we've got, he said, sliding a folder across his desk that felt, by then, like an uncomfortably familiar gesture. Forged signature on a legal release document. Fraudulent notarization performed by a licensed notary who falsely certified she witnessed a signing that never happened. That's not a family disagreement, Ms. Sullivan. Both of those, on their own, are prosecutable felonies in this state. What happens next, I asked. That's partly up to the DA's office and partly up to you. Your mother's attorney is going to try to fold this into a broader civil settlement, get it treated as restitution instead of prosecution. I want you to understand you're not obligated to accept that. You reported this as fraud on the morning it happened, on the record, with a responding officer's report attached. That matters. I thought about it for 3 days before I gave him my answer, sitting with Emma most of those evenings, turning the decision over from every angle I could manage. I thought about the man in the reflective vest checking my license plate at 6:40 in the morning. I thought about the wrong middle initial on a signature that wasn't mine. I thought, too, about my father's face in that stripped office, finally admitting where the missing records had gone, and I understood that whatever I decided here was going to draw a permanent line between the parts of this I could still, someday, imagine forgiving, and the parts I couldn't. I want Diane charged, I told Detective Reyes when he called for my answer. The notarization was deliberate, and it wasn't done under anyone else's pressure that I've seen evidence of. She's a professional who broke the specific rules of her own profession to help steal something from her own niece. And your mother? I sat with that question longer than any other in this whole story. I want the forgery charge to stand, I said finally. But I'd support a plea that keeps her out of jail if the DA's willing to offer one, restitution, probation, a permanent record. I'm not asking for leniency because I think what she did was small. I'm asking for it because I still don't fully know how to want my mother in prison, even after everything, and I'd rather live with that complicated feeling than pretend I don't have it. The DA's office ultimately charged both of them. Diane pled no contest to notary fraud 8 months later, lost her commission permanently, a formality by then, since the county had already revoked it, and received 2 years of probation along with a fine. Linda pled guilty to a reduced forgery charge in exchange for the restitution already underway through the civil case, receiving 3 years of probation and a permanent criminal record that would follow her from that day forward into every background check, every professional license application, every future attempt to present herself as anything other than exactly what a court had now formally, permanently confirmed her to be. I didn't attend either hearing. I'd already sat in enough rooms watching my family explain themselves to strangers. I let Priya tell me the outcome over the phone instead, sitting on my own couch, in an apartment that was entirely, unambiguously mine, and I felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as the quiet, unglamorous relief of a door finally, fully closing. Before any of that, though, there was the deposition, my own, taken under oath in a conference room 3 floors above Priya's office, with Gordon Aldi's sitting across the table from me for 4.5 hours, trying, methodically, to find some crack in my account he could use to argue the whole thing had been an overreaction. Priya had prepped me for 2 full evenings beforehand, running through the kinds of questions Aldi's liked to ask, the way he liked to circle a topic 3 different ways before finally asking it directly, hoping the repetition would eventually produce an inconsistency he could seize on. He's going to ask you, more than once, in more than one way, whether you were angry when you left that dinner, she told me. He wants you on record sounding vindictive instead of measured. Don't perform calm for him. Just answer honestly and let the honesty be calm on its own. Aldi's tried exactly that, about 90 minutes in, leaning back in his chair with the particular practiced casualness of a man who thought he'd finally found his opening. MS, Sullivan, would you say you were angry when you left your parents' home that night? Yes, I said. I was angry and frightened and confused about how my own family had produced a document that precise about money I didn't owe. And isn't it possible, he continued, that anger led you to interpret ordinary family friction, a disagreement about rent, about respect, about your choices, as something far more sinister than it actually was? No, I said. It's not possible because I have 4 years of parking receipts, a forged signature with the wrong middle initial, a notary log with no matching entry, and an audit identifying $164,000 in transactions nobody in your client's family can explain. Anger doesn't forge signatures, Mr. Aldi's. It doesn't reset a company laptop the morning before an audit either. Someone did those things on purpose. He tried 3 more angles that afternoon, each one a little less confident than the last. And by the final hour, even Aldi's seemed to understand he wasn't going to find the version of me he'd apparently gone into that room expecting, someone brittle enough to crack under repetition, someone whose composure was a performance rather than something she'd actually earned, dollar by documented dollar, over months of exactly this kind of scrutiny. Priya walked me out afterward, into the parking garage, and didn't say anything for a full minute, which for Priya was its own kind of compliment. "You didn't give him a single thing to work with," she finally said. 4.5 hours and not one inconsistency. Do you understand how rare that is? I didn't, not fully, not that day. I understand it a little better now, looking back. 4.5 hours of a stranger trying to find a crack in my story, and finding, instead, only the plain, boring, unglamorous fact that I'd told the truth from the very first phone call, and had simply kept telling it, in the same shape, every single time anyone asked. The house itself became unavoidable not long after that. For years, Sullivan Property Holdings had quietly paid the taxes, the insurance, the utilities, and every renovation on that house, while Linda and Michael had contributed almost nothing toward its upkeep out of their own pockets. It had functioned, in practice, as their private home, subsidized entirely by a company that also owned 2 rental units and a commercial kitchen, run by people who apparently believed the distinction between company asset and personal property only mattered when it was convenient. Because the company needed capital to repair the rental units and to begin covering the restitution the audit had already made unavoidable, the board, which was functionally just me, at that point, with the independent property manager and Priya advising, approved a sale of the house. I gave them 60 days to move out. It was longer than the law technically required, and considerably more mercy, I thought, than the deadline they'd once given me. Linda called it cruelty anyway, in a voicemail I saved along with everything else. I mailed her a single-page copy of the original invoice in response, with one line highlighted in yellow. First payment due Sunday. I didn't add interest, I didn't need to. The house sold 6 weeks later to a young couple who planned to actually live in it, a nurse and a high school teacher, as it turned out, who told the listing agent they'd fallen in love with the crepe myrtle in the side yard, the same tree I used to climb as a kid to avoid dinner, when I could tell, even as a child, that the mood in the house had turned. The proceeds restored the company's depleted reserves, covered years of overdue tenant repairs, and funded a substantial portion of the court-ordered restitution. Linda's remaining 20% interest in the company was reduced further by the judgment against her personally, leaving her with considerably less than she'd have had if she'd simply never touched a single dollar that wasn't hers. I was there on moving day. I hadn't planned to be, but Priya needed a final walkthrough signature from a company representative, and I decided, somewhere in the 2 weeks leading up to it, that I wasn't going to let my mother's version of that morning be the only one anyone remembered. Linda stood in the driveway, next to a rented moving truck, watching 2 men she'd hired carry the last of the furniture out of a house that had never technically been hers, and when she saw me get out of my car, she didn't wait for a greeting. "You destroyed this family over $30,000, she said. I looked past her, at the empty garage, at the hook where a spare key had once hung, at the woman standing in a driveway who still, even now, genuinely believed the amount had been the offense. "No," I said, "you priced me at $30,000. The audit priced what you actually did." She asked me, her voice cracking in a way I'd never once heard it crack in 28 years, whether I felt powerful now. "I feel finished," I told her. That answer hurt her more than rage would have, I think, because rage would have kept her at the center of my life a while longer, still directing the story, still the main character in whatever came next. Finished meant something different. It meant she no longer got to write the next chapter of anything involving me. As the moving truck pulled away from that curb for the last time, I didn't feel the triumph I might have expected, watching from a distance 11 days earlier. She had settlement funds left, and options, and a future she was still, technically, free to build however she chose. I wasn't celebrating her losing a roof over her head. I was marking the end of something else entirely, the end of her immunity. The end of a lifetime spent assuming that whatever damage she caused, someone else in that family would quietly absorb the cost of it, so she never had to. She'd lost the house, the business, her authority over a company her own mother had built. Much of her reputation in a town that talks, eventually, no matter how hard you work to control the narrative. And underneath all of it, the thing I think actually hurt the most, the automatic, unquestioned obedience of the people she'd spent decades training to orbit her. The heaviest price wasn't poverty. Linda would never be genuinely poor. She was too resourceful, in her own narrow way, for that. The heaviest price was being forced, for the first time in her adult life, to live without anyone else quietly carrying the consequences of her choices for her. I visited Michael once, about 4 months after the sale, in the one-bedroom apartment he'd moved into after separating from Linda. It was smaller than any place I'd ever seen him live, a modest unit above a dry cleaner with a window unit air conditioner that rattled every time it cycled on, and I remember standing in the doorway feeling a strange, complicated grief I hadn't expected, not for what he'd lost, exactly, but for how long it had apparently taken him to end up somewhere small enough that he could no longer hide inside anyone else's version of events. He'd made coffee before I arrived, badly, the grounds too coarse, and he apologized for it twice before I'd even taken a sip. "I keep replaying that phone call," he said, sitting across from me at a card table that looked like it had come from someone's garage. "The one where I told you to leave the key on the counter. I've had a lot of time to think about why I said it that way instead of just telling you. I thought the whole thing was wrong." "Why did you?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "Because agreeing with your mother was always easier than being right," he said finally. "It had been easier for so long that I stopped noticing I was doing it. I told myself, for years, that staying calm, not making waves, was its own kind of contribution to this family. I understand now that it wasn't. It was just cowardice with better manners." I didn't tell him that was exactly right, though I thought it. I let the sentence sit there between us instead, because I think he needed to hear himself say it more than he needed me to confirm it. "I started seeing someone," he added, "a therapist, once a week. It was your uncle's idea, actually Richard's brother from your mother's side. He went through something similar years ago and gave me a name. I don't know if it's fixing anything, but I understand things now I didn't used to let myself look at directly. Like why I never once, in 28 years, asked you what you actually wanted, instead of just telling you what your mother had already decided for both of us." I left that apartment that afternoon without full forgiveness ready to hand him, because I didn't have it yet, and I don't think either of us expected me to. But I left with something else, something I hadn't had walking in, the sense that my father was, for the first time in longer than I could remember, actually trying to become someone worth eventually forgiving, instead of simply waiting, quietly, for the discomfort to pass on its own. I want to pause here and tell you what the rest of that year actually looked like, because it wasn't all courtrooms and confrontations. Most of it, honestly, was much quieter than that. I started the regional strategy job 3 weeks after that dinner, in the middle of everything else, and I remember sitting in my first team meeting thinking how strange it was that nobody in that conference room had the faintest idea what my mornings had looked like for the past month. To them, I was simply the new strategy lead. Competent, a little quiet at first, good under pressure in a way that, looking back, I understand now, had everything to do with what I was managing at home. My new manager, a woman named Renata Ibera, called me into her office about 6 weeks in, not because anything was wrong with my work, but because she'd noticed, she said carefully, that I sometimes stepped out for calls that clearly weren't client calls. "You don't owe me an explanation," she told me. "I just want you to know that if you ever need flexibility, you have it. I've had years like that too." I didn't tell her everything. I told her enough, a family legal matter, more complicated than I'd expected, mostly resolved, and she nodded like she understood exactly how much that phrase was covering, and never brought it up again except to occasionally, quietly, adjust a deadline without making it a whole conversation. 6 months after the invoice dinner, Sullivan Property Holdings looked nothing like the private, opaque machine Linda had run for years. Tenants had an actual online portal for repair requests, instead of a phone that rang directly into my parents' kitchen. Every vendor contract required independent verification before payment went out. Quarterly financial statements went to every member of the company, with no secret folders and no whispered instructions about what not to ask. I remember the first quarterly statement mailing under the new system, standing at the small printing station in the property manager's office, watching envelopes get sealed and stamped for every single member of the company, including Michael, including, on paper, Linda's remaining reduced interest, since even a judgment against her hadn't fully erased her stake. It felt strange, addressing an envelope to my own mother with nothing but ordinary financial disclosures inside it, No threats, no leverage, no hidden agenda. Just numbers, transparent and available to anyone entitled to see them. I think that was the moment it actually sank in for me that the company had become something fundamentally different from what it had been at that dinner table. Not a weapon anymore, in anyone's hands, just a business, doing exactly what a business is supposed to do. I kept my new job and served as the company's managing member only long enough to get those safeguards properly built and tested. Then I hired a professional property management firm because I understood, somewhere in that process, that real freedom didn't mean replacing my mother at the center of the exact same system. It meant building something that didn't need a single all-powerful person sitting at the middle of it at all. The repair duplex started producing stable, predictable income within a few months. I directed part of the recovered restitution money into a small emergency fund for tenants facing genuine temporary hardship, a rent grace program. Essentially, the opposite of everything the word landlord had come to mean at that dinner table 11 months earlier. My grandmother had built that company to create security for the people connected to it. Linda had spent years quietly converting it into a tool for dependents instead. I wanted whatever came next to restore the original purpose, not just reverse who happened to be holding the power. Emma moved, somewhere in that same stretch of months, from best friend to something closer to chosen family, in a way no legal document could ever fully define, but that I felt every single day regardless. We kept the 30,000 folder on her laptop untouched, a strange kind of trophy neither of us ever talked about deleting. My car stayed mine. I replaced every lock on it, canceled the old spare key permanently, and eventually, slowly, without really noticing the exact day it happened, stopped carrying a printed copy of the police report in my glove compartment, because I no longer needed it close at hand to feel steady. I want to tell you about that first Thanksgiving, because I think it's the part of this story people who have lived something similar will recognize most clearly. Not the courtroom, not the audit, but the strange, specific ache of a major holiday arriving with an empty chair where an entire family used to sit. I hadn't been invited anywhere that felt like home in the traditional sense, and for the first time in 28 years, there was no dinner at my parents' house to dread, or attend, or brace myself for. Just an ordinary Thursday that the rest of the country had decided to treat as a holiday, and a quiet apartment that felt, that particular week, almost unbearably large. Emma showed up at 9 in the morning with 2 grocery bags, and a look on her face that told me she'd already decided we weren't spending the day alone. "We're making a turkey," she announced, setting the bags down on my counter. "A small one. I don't actually know how to cook a turkey, so this is either going to be delicious or a genuine emergency, and either way, we're doing it together." It was, in fact, closer to an emergency than a triumph. We undercooked it the first time, argued cheerfully about oven temperatures for 20 minutes, and eventually ended up ordering Chinese food as a backup while the turkey went back in for another hour. Priya came by that evening once her own family dinner had wrapped up, bringing a pie she admitted, apologetically, she'd bought rather than baked. Sandra Whitlow's daughter, who had gotten to know a little through the case, dropped off a container of stuffing just in case, because apparently her mother had told her the whole story, and she hadn't wanted me spending a holiday without at least one home-cooked dish that had nothing to do with a courtroom. We sat around my small kitchen table that night, a table that had never once held an invoice, never once hosted an ambush, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel on a holiday. I'd braced myself to simply survive. Not the sharp, specific grief of missing my family exactly as they'd actually been. Something gentler than that. A quiet gratitude for the version of family I'd apparently been building all year without fully realizing it. One honest relationship at a time, entirely by accident, out of the wreckage of the one I'd started with. To new traditions, Emma said, raising a glass of the wine she'd also brought, because Emma always brought wine. To turkeys we almost ruined, I said, and everyone laughed, and it was, against every odd I could have named 11 months earlier, one of the better Thanksgivings of my adult life. I hosted a dinner that fall, almost exactly a year after the one that started all of this. In the small dining room of the apartment, I'd signed a lease on entirely by myself, first and last month's rent paid out of my own savings, my name and only my name on the paperwork. Emma came, obviously, and brought a bottle of wine she insisted on opening the moment she walked in, before we'd even finished setting the table. Priya came, tired from a different client's emergency, filing that same afternoon, but unwilling, she said, to miss this particular dinner for anything less than a genuine catastrophe. Daniel Cho came too, which surprised me a little. Forensic accountants, I'd learned over the past year, don't typically get invited back to dinner by the families whose books they'd spent months quietly dismantling. But Daniel had become, somewhere in the process, someone I trusted the way you trust a good doctor who's already seen you at your most exposed and never once made you feel smaller for it. Sandra Whitlow came too, driving in from Birch Street with a pie she'd baked herself, and I watched her stand a little awkwardly near the doorway for the first few minutes, like she wasn't entirely sure she belonged at a table like this, before Emma pulled her into a conversation about nothing in particular, and the awkwardness simply dissolved. We didn't spend the whole evening talking about the case, though it came up, naturally, the way a shared storm always comes up among people who weathered it together. Mostly we talked about ordinary things, Daniel's daughter starting college in the fall, Priya's plans to finally take an actual vacation for the first time in 3 years, Sandra's granddaughter's upcoming graduation. Ordinary conversation had become its own small luxury to me by then, something I no longer took for granted the way I had before that dinner table, a year earlier. Near the end of the evening, once the plates had mostly cleared, Priya raised her glass without any particular ceremony and said, simply, to the 12-page spreadsheet that finally met its match. Everyone laughed, the good kind, the kind that comes easily once enough time has passed that the memory can be held without flinching. I looked around that table, at people who had chosen, at real cost to themselves in some cases, to tell me the truth instead of managing me the way my own family once had, and I understood, sitting there, that I'd built something in that year I hadn't set out to build at all. Not a case. Not a company restructuring. A table full of people who actually meant what they said to my face. I raised my own glass back. To opening the books before anyone gets rescued, I said, and only Priya fully understood the reference, but everyone drank to it anyway, because by then, we'd all learned enough about each other's stories to know that some toasts don't need a full explanation to be worth honoring. Jessica's apology came almost a year later, in the form of a 4-page letter, handwritten, mailed to my new apartment even though I'd never given her the address, which told me Michael had passed it along without asking me first. I remember standing at my own kitchen counter when it arrived, turning the envelope over twice before I opened it, half expecting another round of the same excuses she'd texted me during that first terrible week. Just pay something so Mom gets off everyone's back. You're acting insane, dressed up now in nicer stationery. It wasn't that, entirely, and that surprised me more than I expected it to. The first page was the most honest thing my sister had ever written to me. She admitted, in plain, unpolished language, that she'd laughed at that dinner table because humiliating me had made her feel secure, safer, closer to the center of Linda's approval, for exactly as long as the spotlight stayed pointed somewhere other than at her own choices. She wrote that she'd spent most of her adult life competing with a sister who, in her words, never seemed to notice she was in a competition, and that watching me get invoiced like a stranger had felt, at the time, like evidence she'd finally won something. I know how that sounds now, she wrote. I knew how it sounded then too, if I'm honest. I just didn't let myself sit with it long enough to change course. The next 3 pages explained, at considerable length, why Linda had influenced her the way she had. Childhood comparisons, old resentments about attention and money, about who got sent to which schools, who got which car at 16, who Linda bragged about at church versus who she quietly criticized to her sister on the phone. A long section, dense with old hurt, about how frightened Jessica had been of losing her own place in the family if she'd ever pushed back on anything our mother wanted. I read all 4 pages twice. I sat with them for 3 full days before I let myself respond, because I wanted to make sure whatever I wrote back came from clarity instead of the leftover adrenaline of finally being asked to forgive someone. I wrote back 1 sentence. An explanation is not repayment. She didn't write again for almost 2 months. When she finally did, it was shorter, more careful, and it didn't ask for anything, just a single line, letting me know she'd started seeing a therapist of her own, unprompted, and that she wasn't writing to be forgiven, only to let me know the letter hadn't been the end of whatever work she still owed herself. We communicate rarely now, and only when she reaches out without demanding access to my life the way she used to assume she was owed. I don't call what we have healed. I call it honest enough to remain limited, which turns out to be its own kind of peace, once you stop needing every relationship to resolve into something warmer than it's actually capable of being. A local business journal ran a short piece about the case that winter, buried in the back section under a headline about county fraud prosecutions, 3 paragraphs long, mostly dry legal language pulled straight from the DA's press release. It didn't name me directly. The article referred to me only as a family member and majority stakeholder, but it named Linda and Diane and the company, and within a day, half of Santa Ana's small, tightly connected business community seemed to have read it. Marisol, who managed the front desk at my new firm's regional office and had become, over the past year, someone I trusted with more of my actual life than I'd expected to trust a coworker with, brought me a printed copy that morning, folded carefully, like she wasn't sure whether handing it to me would feel like an intrusion or a kindness. "I wasn't going to say anything," she said, "but I thought you'd rather see it from me than stumble onto it in a client meeting." I read it standing at my own desk, and I felt something unexpected settle over me, not embarrassment, which is what I might have predicted a year earlier, but a strange, quiet satisfaction at seeing the whole thing reduced to exactly what it was. 3 paragraphs of plain fact, no adjectives, no family narrative, no dinner table theatrics. Just names, dates, and dollar amounts printed in a public record for anyone who cared to look. A former colleague from my San Francisco agency texted me that same afternoon, someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year. "Is this your family?" I sat with the question for a moment before I answered honestly. "Yes, it's a long story. I'm okay." She wrote back something I didn't expect, not pity, not curiosity dressed up as concern, just a simple, "I'm proud of you for however you handled that," which struck me, reading it at my desk, as one of the kindest things anyone had said to me in months, precisely because she had no idea yet what handling it had actually required. I understood, reading that short article over and over that week, something about how differently the same set of facts can land depending on who's telling them. At that dinner table, the story had been, Amber came home broke and ungrateful, and her family finally held her accountable. In the audit, the story had been, a family systematically defrauded a company, a bank, and their own daughter to cover a shortfall they'd created themselves. Both stories used the same 12 months of my life as raw material. Only one of them was ever actually true. There's one more person I haven't told you about yet, and I want to, because I think she taught me something I used constantly during that year without ever fully naming it until much later. Her name was Grace Delacroix, and she'd been my first real boss, back at the boutique agency in Sacramento, where I'd started my career at 22, terrified and underqualified on paper for a job I'd somehow talked my way into anyway. Grace had a rule she repeated often enough that I'd absorbed it the way you absorb a favorite song's lyrics without ever meaning to memorize them. Never let someone else's crisis become your character. I called her, of all people, the week after that first dinner, not entirely sure why, except that some old instinct told me she'd know what to do with a story this size without flinching from it. "Tell me everything," she said, and I did, the whole thing, start to finish, sitting in my car outside Emma's apartment with the engine off and the windows cracked. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Amber," she said finally, "I want you to hear this clearly because I think you're going to need it more than once over the next few months. Your family is trying to write your character for you right now. Broke, embarrassed, ungrateful, unstable, whatever version serves them in a given room. The only real defense against that is refusing to let their crisis become your character instead of theirs. Document everything. Stay measured. And do not, under any circumstances, let their panic convince you that you're the one who did something wrong here." I thought about that advice more times than I could count over the following year, in Priya's conference room, in that stripped office with 3 empty filing cabinets, across a witness table from Gordon Aldi's for 4.5 hours. Every time I felt the old, familiar pull to shrink myself down to a size that would make everyone else more comfortable, I heard Grace's voice instead. Don't let their crisis become your character. She wrote a character reference for me herself, unprompted, when the background check controversy around Jessica's job loss made its way, secondhand, into a few professional circles that overlapped with mine. I never asked her to. She simply heard, through a mutual contact, that questions were circulating about some family legal trouble, and she got ahead of it before I even knew there was anything to get ahead of, sending a short, direct email to two people who mattered in my current industry, vouching for exactly the kind of person I actually was. I called to thank her once I found out. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I know," she said. "That's usually why it's worth doing." Michael attends counseling now, weekly, something he told me about almost sheepishly on the phone, like he expected me to laugh at the idea of him finally doing the work he'd avoided his entire adult life by staying quiet and calling it peacekeeping. He sends birthday cards. Actual ones mailed, with a few handwritten lines inside instead of a group text. Last spring, one of them included a single paragraph about how he'd started volunteering at a legal aid clinic 2 evenings a month, helping people fill out paperwork they didn't fully understand. His own quiet, unspoken penance, I think, for a lifetime of signing things he'd never bothered to read closely enough himself. I don't call our relationship healed either. I call it honest enough to be worth continuing, slowly, on terms I set instead of terms handed to me across a dinner table. Diane never apologized. Not once, not in any form, not even the flawed, self-serving version Jessica eventually managed. She tried for a while to keep her place at family gatherings, showed up to a cousin's engagement party the following spring as if nothing had happened, as if a revoked notary commission and a company-wide fraud referral were simply an unfortunate misunderstanding everyone had collectively agreed to move past. People stopped listening to her explanations fairly quickly once they'd had the chance to read the audit for themselves. I heard, secondhand, that she left that engagement party early. Nobody, apparently, walked her to her car. A cousin who'd once been close to her told me, months later, almost apologetically, that Diane had spent most of that evening standing near the drink table alone, and that watching it happen had felt less like justice and more like the particular, ordinary sadness of watching someone slowly run out of people willing to pretend not to know what they'd done. Linda wrote to me twice over the following year. The first letter blamed nearly everyone available to blame: Evelyn, the economy, Michael, me, in roughly that order, 3 full pages of it, without a single sentence that resembled an apology anywhere inside it. She wrote that she'd only ever wanted to teach me the value of money, that the invoice had been tough love, not theft, that she'd expected me, of all her children, to understand the difference. I read it once, standing at my own kitchen counter, and felt almost nothing at all, not the old sting I might have expected, just a flat, distant recognition of a woman still, even now, unable to find her way to a single honest sentence about what she'd actually done. I put it in a drawer and didn't reread it. The second letter came almost 5 months later, and it was shorter, and different in a way that actually surprised me. She wrote that she'd started working at another catering company, as an employee this time, not an owner, taking direction from a chef half her age who corrected her in front of the rest of the kitchen staff when she got something wrong. She wrote that she'd begun to understand, in a way she said she never had before, what it felt like to answer to someone else's rules for a change, to be the one at the bottom of a hierarchy instead of the one who built and controlled it. She didn't call it fair. She didn't quite call it deserved either. But she asked, at the very end of the letter, whether we could meet, just the two of us, and something in the plainness of that request, no threats woven into it this time, no mention of the company, no mention of money at all, made me consider it seriously for the first time since that dinner table. I agreed to exactly one conversation, in Priya's conference room, not at a cafe dressed up as some kind of casual reconciliation neither of us had actually earned yet. I wanted a room with a table between us, and I wanted a witness in the building even if not physically present in the room, because I'd learned enough, by then, not to walk into any conversation with my mother without some version of a record. Linda arrived alone, without an audience for the first time in this entire story, no Diane whispering instructions at the edge of the room, no Michael standing beside her softening whatever she said next. She looked smaller than I remembered her, not physically, exactly, but in some quieter way I couldn't fully name, like a person who'd spent a year discovering how much of her presence had always depended on other people being too afraid to leave the room. She spent nearly an hour searching for some version of the past in which fear had excused her choices. She told me about the year, 15 years earlier, that Gerald Aucaffer had alluded to on the phone, a period, she said, where the family had been closer to losing everything than any of us kids had ever known. A debt she'd taken on quietly and never fully climbed out from under, one she said had taught her that money disappeared the moment you weren't vigilant enough about protecting it. I let her talk. I'd learned, by then, that interrupting her only ever gave her a new grievance to work with, a new detour away from the actual point. I was scared, she said, near the end, her voice cracking in a way I still wasn't fully used to hearing from her. I've been scared for years, Amber. I didn't know how to say that to anyone without it looking like weakness, so I turned it into something else instead. Rules, numbers, control. I told myself that was love. It wasn't love, I said. It might have started as fear. But by the time it reached me at that dinner table, it was a plan, Mom. A plan with a bank deadline attached to it. I understand being scared. I don't accept being invoiced for it. When she finished, I told her that forgiveness wasn't a door she could simply knock on until I decided to open it. It was something I might, or might not, come to feel privately, slowly, over time, and it wasn't something owed on any particular schedule. It wouldn't restore her old authority over the company. It wouldn't erase the judgment against her. It wouldn't return the house, and it certainly wouldn't make me responsible for managing her comfort ever again. So this is my punishment forever, she said. The punishment ended when the court orders ended, I told her. These are boundaries, that's a different thing. That distinction, I think, was the one thing she had never once, in her entire life, been asked to learn. Before she left, she asked whether I still had the original invoice. I did. I drove out to the cemetery the week after that conversation with Linda, alone, with a bouquet of the same white roses my grandmother used to keep in a chipped vase on her office desk. The one detail about her I remembered more clearly than almost anything else from childhood. I hadn't visited often since she died. I want to be honest about that, because I think grief sometimes works that way. The people we lose the most formative parts of ourselves to are sometimes the hardest graves to stand in front of, not because we don't miss them, but because missing them opens up everything else we haven't finished processing yet. I sat down on the grass beside her headstone, the way I used to sit on the floor beside her desk, and I told her everything out loud, quietly, the way you'd update a friend who'd been away a long time. The invoice, the tow truck, the blue box, and everything it had turned out to hold. The audit, the courtroom, Linda's driveway, the 60 days, the sale. I told her about Emma and Priya and Daniel Cho and Sandra Whitlow's pie at my dinner table. I told her I understood now why the office door had closed to me at 13, and why it had never fully needed to make sense to me until exactly the year she'd planned for it to. You knew, I said out loud to a headstone that obviously couldn't answer me back, though it felt, in that particular cemetery, quiet like it might. You knew before any of us did what she was capable of. You just made sure I'd have what I needed by the time it mattered. I thought about her line, the one now framed in my home office. Do not rescue anyone before the books are opened. I understood, sitting there, that it hadn't only ever been advice about Linda, or Michael, or Jessica, or Diane. It had been advice about myself, too, about the version of me that had spent 28 years quietly rescuing my family from having to face their own choices, absorbing whatever needed absorbing so the peace could hold a little longer. I didn't do that this time. I think she knew somehow, sitting there at that desk with her fountain pen and her careful ledgers, that I eventually wouldn't. Before I left, I set the roses down against the base of the stone, the way she used to set them in that chipped vase every Sunday without fail, and I said the only thing that felt true enough to leave her with. Thank you for not leaving me the parts of this family that couldn't be trusted with the truth. I want to go back for a moment to something I told you at the very beginning of this story, that all I'd asked for, walking into that house 11 days before the invoice, was 1 week where nobody graded me. 1 week of privacy, which my mother had translated, without my permission, into failure. About 14 months after that dinner, once the company had stabilized, once the criminal cases had resolved, once the settlement funds had cleared, and the last of the paperwork had finally stopped arriving in my mailbox every other week, I took that week. Not a dramatic trip. I didn't fly anywhere exotic or make some grand statement out of it. I just told my new job, the regional strategy role I'd gotten weeks after that first dinner, the one I was thriving in by then, trusted enough to actually take real time off without 3 people covering for me, that I needed a full week, no calls, no check-ins, and I meant it in a way I'd never quite managed to mean it before. I rented a small cabin 2 hours up the coast, the kind of place with spotty cell service and a view of nothing but water and pine trees, and I brought exactly 1 bag, the same size as the one I'd packed the night I walked out of my parents' house. Emma came for the first 3 days, and we didn't talk about the case once, not one single time, which felt, by the 3rd morning, like its own kind of miracle. I spent the rest of that week alone. I read 4 books I'd been meaning to read for 2 years. I cooked meals nobody critiqued. I slept until whatever hour my body decided on, without a single person waiting downstairs with a spreadsheet. On the 5th evening, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, I thought about that dinner table one more time, really thought about it, all the way through, without flinching away from any part of it the way I'd sometimes still caught myself doing, even 14 months later. I thought about the version of that week I'd originally wanted, before Linda decided to fill it with an invoice instead. And I understood, sitting there, that I'd finally gotten it, just 14 months later than planned, and considerably more hard won than I'd ever intended it to be. Nobody graded me that week. Nobody would ever get to again, not in the way they used to, not without my permission. I should tell you what happened with the job, too, because I think it matters, and because I don't want you to walk away from this story thinking the only thing I built in that year was a legal case. I got the regional strategy role about 6 weeks after that first dinner, in the middle of everything else. And for the first several months, I did the work quietly, competently, mostly invisible to anyone above my direct manager, which was exactly how I wanted it, given what else was happening in every other part of my life at the time. That changed a little, about 8 months in, when a client relationship I'd been managing hit a genuine crisis of its own. Not fraud, nothing close to what I'd been living through at home, just an ordinary, high-stakes business dispute over a missed deliverable that threatened to cost the firm a 7-figure account. My director asked me to lead the recovery conversation, mostly, I think, because everyone else on the team wanted to avoid it. I walked into that meeting the same way I'd walked into every meeting that year, calm, prepared, unwilling to let anyone's anger dictate the terms of the conversation before I'd had a chance to lay out the facts. I didn't know, at the time, how much that particular skill had been quietly built, dinner table by dinner table, courtroom by courtroom, over the previous 8 months. I just knew how to sit across from someone who wanted me to panic, and not give them what they wanted. The client stayed. My director noticed. 6 months after that, Renata called me into her office again, and this time it wasn't about flexibility. "I want to be straightforward with you," she said. "I don't know exactly what you've been managing outside of work this year. I've noticed you handle pressure differently than almost anyone else on this team, steadier, somehow, even when the stakes are high. I'd like to talk about a director track role opening up next quarter." I didn't tell her, that day, about the invoice, or the tow truck, or the courtroom with the beige walls. I told her simply that I'd had a difficult year, and that I'd learned more from it than I'd ever expected to. She didn't push for details. She just nodded, the way Beatrice-type women do when they've clearly had their own version of a difficult year at some point and know better than to ask for more than someone's willing to give. I took the promotion. I sat in my new office, 6 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon that felt almost unbearably ordinary, and I thought about my mother's voice at that dinner table, telling me, essentially, that I'd come home a failure. I thought about how certain she'd sounded, how certain all 4 of them had sounded, actually, gathered around that table like a jury that had already reached its verdict before the trial even started. They had been wrong about nearly everything that mattered. I let myself sit with that fact for exactly as long as it took to finish my coffee, and then I went back to work, because by then, I'd learned something else too, that the best answer to being underestimated was rarely a speech delivered in the moment. It was simply continuing to build, quietly, for as long as it took, until the results made the argument for you. It hangs in my home office now, framed, beside a small handwritten card with my grandmother's line copied onto it in my own handwriting. "Do not rescue anyone before the books are opened." I didn't keep that invoice because I enjoy remembering the humiliation of that dinner table. I kept it because it marks the exact moment my family's story about me, broke, embarrassed, finally cut down to size, turned into evidence against them instead. I walked into that dinner believing I needed my family to confirm I hadn't failed at anything. I walked out of that house 11 days later believing, instead, that I needed to prove them wrong. By the end of it, I'd learned something a little more useful than either of those things. People who are committed to misunderstanding you will turn every single defense you offer into another trial. The strongest answer isn't always a speech, and it almost never needs to be loud. Sometimes it's a locked account, a preserved text message, a signed affidavit, and the plain, unglamorous courage to let consequences arrive on their own schedule without interrupting them to make yourself feel better faster. I think about the version of that night where I did something different, where I sat back down at that table, apologized for whatever imagined offense had earned me a 12-page spreadsheet, and promised to have $2,000 by Sunday. I run that version sometimes, late at night, the way I think most people run the road not taken. In that version, I never find the blue box. Linda's authority never gets revoked before the bank renewal clears. The $180,000 line of credit funds on schedule, backed by my name as guarantor, and I spend the next several years discovering, slowly, painfully, exactly how much of my own financial life had quietly become collateral for a company I didn't even know I was about to inherit. In that version, I'm still the daughter everyone privately describes as difficult, for the crime of eventually asking one question too many. I didn't live that version. I lived this one instead, and I want to tell you honestly that it cost me things the other version wouldn't have. A relationship with my sister that will likely never be what it might have been under different circumstances. A father I still don't fully trust, even as I watch him try, slowly, to become someone worth trusting again. An aunt I no longer speak to at all and don't expect to. A mother who will spend the rest of her life carrying a criminal record, a revoked reputation, and the particular, specific grief of having built her entire identity around control, only to lose every ounce of it in a single documented year. I don't regret the cost. I want to be careful here, because I think it would be easy to tell this story as if the ending erased the price of getting there, and it didn't. Some nights, even now, I still feel the strange, unwanted grief of missing a family that mostly existed as a performance I hadn't been let in on. That grief doesn't fully go away just because the outcome was fair. It just gets quieter, over time, sitting beside everything I built instead of underneath it. My mother demanded $30,000, 10% monthly interest, and my car. 1 week later, she was begging me to come home, because the mail she'd been dreading revealed that the house she ruled, the company she quietly drained, and the books she tried so hard to keep hidden were no longer, and would never again be, under her control. I did go back, not as the frightened daughter they'd expected to pressure into silence at that table. I went back as the majority owner who opened every file they'd spent a week trying to keep closed. They wanted a tenant they could charge whatever they liked, a scapegoat they could shame in front of an audience, a rescue fund they assumed they could quietly drain the moment I got scared enough to hand it over. Instead, they created the one witness capable of ending the entire arrangement for good. Would you have paid the money, accepted a hollow apology, and let the family home stay exactly as it was? Or would you have let every documented consequence land, one by one, without stepping in to soften a single one of them? I know my answer now. Family can ask you for grace. It doesn't get to demand immunity, and it never did, no matter how many years it managed to convince you otherwise. The night I walked out of that house with one bag and my own car keys, I genuinely believed I was losing my place in that family. What I actually lost, it turned out, was only the role they'd assigned me without ever once asking whether I wanted it. I think about my grandmother more than I expected to, a couple of years out from all of this, not the sick woman I visited in her final months, but the version of her I remember from those Sunday afternoons at the roll-top desk, patient, methodical, building something out of nothing while everyone around her assumed a woman alone couldn't possibly manage it. I understand now that she wasn't just building a company in that room. She was quietly teaching me, years before I knew I'd need it, that the people who underestimate you rarely bother to prepare for the version of you that's actually paying attention. If you've made it this far, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to Revenge Lab. If this story meant something to you, if some part of you has ever sat across a table from people who decided, together, that you were worth less than the truth, I hope you'll stay with us here, because that's exactly the moment every story we tell is really about. Everything I built afterward finally belonged to me. And nobody, not my mother, not the family company, not a 12-page invoice with a $160 processing fee tacked onto the end of it, ever got to price me again.